Hey guys, tonight we slide softly back into the tatami-woven world of ancient Japan, where cherry blossoms drift through candlelight and paper walls can't quite muffle the sound of, well, nothing. Because tonight, sex is banned. You're lying there, the air thick with the scent of pine resin and quiet tension. Your lover's fingers just barely grazing yours beneath the mosquito net when you both remember. It's a red day, not a national holiday, a sex ban day. You probably won't survive this with your sanity intact. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, post your location and local time. I want to know who else is sleepless tonight. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. It starts with a calendar. Not the cheerful kind pinned to your kitchen fridge, but a silk scroll drawn up by court astrologers and ritual experts. Every stroke of ink potentially spelling out a night of enforced celibacy. The ancient Japanese calendar, known as the lunisolar system, wove time from both the moon's moods and the sun's consistency. And with it came inauspicious days, red-marked dates where it was believed that bodily unions, even the ones done under a blanket and in the name of love, would anger the gods, defile purity, and generally mess with cosmic balance. You're not just deciding between missionary or spooning. You're deciding whether your orgasm might invite divine retribution. Sleep tight. Sleep. Historians still argue whether these restrictions were primarily religious, political, or just a great excuse to control the population without making it sound like a royal edict against fun. But the prohibitions were very real and very complex. They often coincided with rituals of purification, full moons, or imperial ceremonies. Sex wasn't sinful. Exactly, it just had to be timed like a seasonal dish. You're not allowed to make love on the first day of the lunar month, nor during funerals, nor after touching blood, nor when the emperor was ill. And no, the moon phase isn't helping your case tonight either. Let's say you're living in the Nara period, around 700 CE. You wake up in a wooden house that leaks wind through the floorboards, grab your rice ball, and glance at the scroll hanging by the doorway. Today's a kuchi-hiki-bi, a mouth-pulling day. Sounds sexy, but it isn't. It's a red day. No sex, no hunting, and definitely no weddings. Local shrines hang up wooden placards reminding villagers not to contaminate the spiritual harmony of the day. You obey, mostly because your grandmother's ghost still gives you stink eye every time you break taboo. And maybe, just maybe, you're a little afraid of what might happen if you don't. Rumors circulate of a couple who ignored the ban last spring and gave birth to a baby with teeth already and not ideal. The belief behind the ban days is rooted in Shinto, Japan's indigenous religion, where cleanliness and ritual order are the backbone of existence. Sex wasn't dirty in itself, but it did represent chaos. Bodily fluids, especially those tied to reproduction, were classified as kagare, or spiritual pollution. You needed to keep the cosmic books balanced, and that meant abstaining during certain celestial alignments, festival periods, or moments of national mourning. In short, the universe is watching, and it does not want to see you naked right now. One rather poetic story comes from a Heian court lady's diary, where she laments being turned away from her lover's gate, not because he'd lost interest, but because the priests had announced a prohibited day due to the emperor's recent bout of indigestion. Apparently, even imperial flatulence could change your plans. She writes I composed a verse instead of knocking, and returned to my rooms as chaste as I was cold. No sex. But hey, excellent poetry. There's also a more political layer to all this. When rulers could dictate when their people could or couldn't have sex, they weren't just managing moral behavior, they were flexing subtle power over family lines, inheritance timing, and even fertility cycles. Scholars still debate whether these restrictions actually reduced birth rates, but the psychological pressure was certainly effective. Imagine the entire imperial court operating like a moody HR department for your libido. Now, imagine you can't appeal to management. Among the quirky practices born from these taboos was the custom of dream venting. On red days, lovers who were forbidden from touching would lie next to each other and describe their fantasies in meticulous detail, every rustle of fabric, every stolen glance, without ever acting on them. The idea was that by transferring desire into words, you could express without transgressing. Sound familiar? It's basically erotic fan fiction before fan fiction existed. This ritual even found its way into court poetry, where verses written in longing tones hinted at forbidden rendezvous, never consummated unless the stars allowed it. Our first source story tonight comes from Eleanor Herman's Sex with Kings, which mentions how sexual taboos weren't unique to Japan, but were unusually rigid in its court life. One Japanese noblewoman described her consort being dragged by priests into abstinence after an astrologer warned that his next climax could shift the season out of joint. He instead wrote a haiku, lit incense, and went to bed alone. That's one way to avoid child support. Meanwhile, everyday folks, your average rice farmer or fishmonger, weren't exempt from these bans. While they didn't have court calendars, they relied on oral traditions and regional almanacs passed around like religious texts. The local shrine would announce sex ban days with gongs, and neighbors would gossip if your wife looked suspiciously radiant the next morning. One temple in Kyushu even kept a registry of shame, where names of those caught violating red days were recorded and ritually cleansed with salt. Imagine having your sex life publicly salted. So tonight, as you lie in the cool dark, imagine the weight of time pressing down on your body, not just with sleep, but with centuries of rules about when desire could be expressed. You wrap yourself in the quiet knowledge that your ancestors weren't just sleeping next to their lovers. They were timing them, with scrolls, with omens, with whispered prayers to kami who really didn't want to see your O-face. And as you breathe slower, deeper, and the night pulls you under, remember the calendar always wins. You're still lying there, tangled in the silk threads of old laws and older gods, when you feel at the eyes, not your partners, divine ones, watching, judging. In ancient Japan, the gods were not passive background deities you left fruit offerings for. Once a year, they were bureaucratic, nosy, emotionally volatile entities with long memories, and the moral flexibility of a medieval HOA committee. Chief among these celestial supervisors were the kami of Shinto, spirits of nature, ancestors, and sometimes just that weird rock in your yard. These kami weren't omnipotent, but they were always watching, especially when you were naked. The idea that a spiritual force could be offended by your private bedroom activity wasn't just religious superstition. It was cultural oxygen. You breathe it in every time you glance at the moon and wonder if tonight's another bad day. It probably is. Take the goddess Amaterasu, sun deity, and one of the core figures of Japanese mythology, according to the Kojiki. She once got so offended by her unruly brother, Suzanu's antics, which included hurling a skinned pony into her weaving room that she hid in a cave and plunged the world into darkness. The gods had to lure her out with dance, and, notably, the sound of laughter after one goddess exposed her breasts. Sexuality, in that moment, was a cosmic tool, but not always a welcome one. You realize quickly that in this universe, sex was both sacred and dangerous, an offering and a potential insult. Get the timing wrong, and you don't just break a taboo, you unbalance the universe. Historians still argue whether these stories were metaphors for agricultural cycles or coded warnings for aristocratic behavior. But what's clear is that mythology shaped daily life. Temples and shrines didn't just offer blessings, they posted calendars of days when sex, marriage, childbirth, and even touching your own body were restricted. Some regions banned not only intercourse, but thinking about sex during certain festivals. You imagine a poor fisherman sitting on a cold dock, trying desperately not to fantasize about his neighbor's daughter because the rice planting festival was coming up. Spoiler, he fails. From Michel Foucault's History of Sexuality, we learn that societies don't just repress sexuality, they ritualize it, organize it, give it roles. And in Japan, the role was often to submit desire to the larger rhythm of nature and politics. Sex wasn't just for pleasure or procreation. It was a moment of permeability, where bodies could transmit spiritual pollution. So the gods, always looming, had to be appeased first. You weren't just making love, you were performing a ritual that had to be in sync with the sacred calendar, or else. Or else often meant misfortune, disease, or a sudden storm ruining your barley crop. One odd example is the annual fertility festival in Tagata Shrine, where today a massive wooden phallus is paraded through the streets and worshipped openly. But even this overt celebration of sexuality is bound to strict timing and ritual. You don't get to be horny whenever you want. You get one day a year. The rest. Back to shame and careful scheduling. Modern onlookers laugh and cheer, but the underlying message remains: sex is a force, and forces must be controlled. A particularly juicy tale comes from Peter Webb's The Erotic Spirit Through History, describing how shrine maidens, or miko, were simultaneously spiritual conduits and sexual outcasts. While they performed dances and rituals for kami, many were forbidden from marrying or even touching men on certain days. One miko from Izumo Shrine allegedly fell in love with a traveling poet and met him under the cherry trees one spring night. Their affair lasted 7 nights until the 8th, a red day, when she was caught. The punishment: ritual expulsion, symbolic haircutting, and a quiet death in a mountain convent. You imagine her pacing in the shadows, whispering her lover's name into the mist. Romance meet regulation. Meet. The gods didn't just punish with thunder and exile. Sometimes they punished with guilt. People believed that violating band days could cause miscarriages, infertility, or bring misfortune on the entire village. Imagine getting blamed for a drought because you couldn't keep your pants on last Tsuitachi. It happened. There's even a folktale from the Edo period about a couple whose baby was born with no shadow, an ominous mark of sex had on a forbidden day. The child was said to wander graveyards at night, searching for its missing spirit. And yes, some people cheated. Enter the fringe tidbit of tonight love potions made from eel liver and night soil. These were believed to make the gods turn their gaze away during banned nights, creating a window of privacy. Think of it like a divine blindfold made from questionable ingredients. You picture a merchant mumbling a prayer over a bowl of fish guts, then darting into the bedroom like a burglar with a guilty conscience. Was it effective? Probably not. But desperate times. Desperate potions. Another sex story. This one from Eleanor Herman's Sex with Kings. Again involves a foreign visitor to Japan in the 17th century. A Dutch trader named John, who recorded in his diary that his Japanese lover refused to see him for 3 nights due to something she called kami days. Frustrated and confused, he tried to bribe a local priest to change the date. The priest reportedly laughed so hard he choked on his rice. No dice. The gods have better calendars than the Dutch East India Company. You start to notice how the fabric of society was stitched with abstinence as a kind of obedience. It wasn't about being puritanical. It was about maintaining ritual integrity. Sex, if done on the wrong day, wasn't immoral. It was incorrect, like putting your shoes on the wrong feet before entering a shrine. It jarred the harmony. And harmony, in ancient Japan, was everything. Even the way people expressed desire had to change. When you couldn't act on passion, you wrote it. One nobleman composed a poem about sneaking past the red gate of sexless nights to dream of a lover he couldn't touch. Another recorded a dream in which he visited the gods themselves to ask permission for an exception. The gods, in his dream, gave him a peach and told him to wait. Symbolic extremely. Satisfying not in the slightest. Yet beneath all this repression was a strange kind of intimacy. Couples who observed these rules together often developed rituals of their own, massaging each other without touching impure zones, whispering erotic poems, practicing breathing in sync. You find yourself smiling at the thought sometimes. The rules made them more creative. And, let's be honest, more patient. As the candle flickers low, and the shadows lengthen across your imaginary tatami mat, you start to feel the strange comfort of it all. The discipline, the rhythm, the idea that the universe is so attuned. Even your heartbeat and your body's longing must fit into its flow. That sex isn't just an act, it's a season, a tide, a gesture towards something larger than pleasure. It's one more way of saying I belong to this time, this land, this world of gods who watch too closely, and lovers who still try anyway. You wake to birdsong and the soft creak of the paper doors as they slide open, and for a moment, you forget what day it is. Then the dread settles in. It's another abstinence day. And this time, the reason isn't a god's grudge or a rogue comet. It's the emperor's body. Not his will, not his mood, his body. Because in ancient Japan, the emperor wasn't just a political figurehead. He was the national timepiece, a living calendar, and his digestion, illnesses, even his dreams dictated ritual behavior for everyone else. You're not allowed to have sex because somewhere in the capital, His Majesty has a cough. This isn't satire. This is how the sacred hierarchy worked. From as early as the Yamato period, emperors were viewed as descendants of the sun goddess Amaterasu, and therefore vessels of spiritual resonance. If the emperor was ill, the empire was spiritually compromised. No agriculture, no ceremonies, and certainly no sex. His condition rippled through the social fabric like a sneeze in a crowded train. On certain days when his health fluctuated, court astrologers would issue proclamations restricting sexual activity across regions. You imagine yourself standing beside your lover, both holding your breath, wondering if today's imperial hiccup means another night of cold celibacy. Historians still argue whether this was a genuinely spiritual practice or just an elite power move disguised in ritual. After all, when one man's bowel movements can shut down everyone else's intimacy. You start to question the motives. Was it reverence, or was it just another way to tighten the leash? In a court culture obsessed with order, the emperor's body wasn't private, it was political real estate. Every ache, every tremble, every whispered symptom was recorded and analyzed by diviners, who then crafted the lunar calendar accordingly. Your sex life, in other words, was scheduled around a stranger's stomachache. One record from the Heian period describes a 4-day abstinence order following the emperor's fainting spell. The official reason to restore cosmic equilibrium through bodily restraint, which sounds noble until you realize it meant postponing weddings, delaying pregnancies, and even canceling certain bath rituals. Yes, even bathing was suspended in solidarity. Because if the emperor can't enjoy his bath, neither can you. There's also something theatrical about it all. The emperor, rarely seen by commoners, becomes this abstract force, half man, half metronome, whose health determines the nation's pulse. He's carried in lacquered palanquins, his face veiled, and his every movement shrouded in mystery. You begin to wonder if he even knows that his leg cramp last Thursday prevented 100 peasants from conceiving children. Probably not. Or maybe that's part of the mystique. The more unknowable he is, the more potent his body becomes as a symbolic tool. A particularly strange tale from Peter Webb's work tells of an empress who, upon falling ill, ordered a full month of abstinence throughout the capital. Not just in court. Everywhere. Traders, priests, farmers, even prostitutes were forbidden from working. You picture the brothels shuttered, their clients wandering the streets confused, and one poor madam screaming into a kimono sleeve. What does a royal headache have to do with my mortgage? But it was enforced. Shrine maidens walked the streets with scrolls listing restricted behaviors. There were even reports of public shaming rituals where violators had to wear wooden masks shaped like crying infants. Subtle, not really. Tonight's sex story comes from Sex with Kings again, and it's a juicy one. A noblewoman named Fujiwara no Michiko was the favored consort of a high-ranking prince. Their trysts were legendary for their poetry, their secrecy, and their timing. They made love during an imperial illness ban, and when caught, she was demoted and forced to serve tea to junior concubines for 2 years. But what makes her story special is the poem she sent afterward, which read, "If the sun must dim for our sin, let me live in the shadow forever." Historians debate whether that line was remorseful or just passive-aggressive brilliance. Either way, the prince reportedly wept. As odd as it seems, this emperor body as clock idea wasn't unique to Japan. Michel Foucault wrote that power often extends through biology. In medieval Europe, kings were said to have the king's touch, a healing magic through their physical body. In Japan, the emperor's touch wasn't healing. It was regulating. His vitality governed time, and time governed you. Even on the household level, people adjusted their intimacy based on palace whispers. If news spread that the emperor had taken ill, men avoided their wives not out of piety, but fear. Superstition fed rumors that sex during these periods would transmit the weakness to future children. That brings us to one of the fringe tidbits, the mirror fasting ritual. During abstinence days triggered by imperial health, nobles covered their mirrors with cloth. Why? Because it was believed that gazing into your own face on such days could trap you in a state of impurity. The self, reflected, was vulnerable to spiritual contamination. So if you couldn't look at yourself, you certainly couldn't look at someone else. While doing the deed, mirrors off, lights low, libido, paused. Even festivals weren't safe. The emperor's annual rice planting ritual, known as the Taoe Sai, was so sacred that it cast a ripple of abstinence across the calendar. Weeks before and after the event were marked as spiritually significant, requiring both abstention from sex and purification rituals involving salt, chanting, and the burning of incense made from bamboo ash. You can almost smell it, the sharp, smoky perfume that lingers in the corners of the room, reminding you that tonight is not for passion, it's for patience, and patience was rewarded. Sometimes, on days when the emperor's health was robust and stars aligned just right, the court would declare auspicious nights the rare and precious inverse of sex ban days. Lovers rushed to take advantage, letters were exchanged with haste, and innkeepers offered discounted rooms. There's a record of one such night when a noblewoman sent out 3 suitors on the same evening. Only one arrived on time. He stayed until morning and left with a poem tucked in his sleeve. Something about dew and destiny. So as you lie here now, tracing the path of time, not through your own body but through someone else's, you begin to understand the strange harmony of it all. In this world, desire is never isolated. It's part of a choreography involving gods, stars, emperors, and seasons. Your body doesn't belong solely to you. It's a node in a vast and delicate network. And sometimes that network says not tonight, but there's beauty in that, too. In waiting. In knowing that when the ban lifts, it means something. That when you do finally touch each other again, it's not just about want. It's about timing, rhythm, the pleasure of alignment. And maybe, just maybe, that's worth obeying a few red-marked days for. You pull your blanket tighter and roll to your side, hoping to escape the buzzing thought that tonight is yet another night of no. Not because you don't want to, not because your partner's snoring, not even because your mood's off, but because the calendar says so. The moon is wrong, the day is dirty, and somewhere in the fog of ritual and restriction, you're not even sure why it's forbidden tonight. But that's the thing, many of these prohibitions came bundled in overlapping taboos, religious, astrological, and bodily, all braided together like the cords of a ceremonial robe. Welcome to the chaotic intimacy of ban days, bath days, and blood. Let's start with blood. Specifically, menstrual blood. In ancient Japan, menstruation wasn't seen as shameful in a moral sense. It was seen as a force, a form of kegare, or spiritual pollution. Shinto, with its obsession for ritual purity, treated menstruation as a time when the body was vulnerable to impurity, not evil, just out of sync with sacred harmony. This meant that on days when a woman bled, she was barred from shrines, rituals, certain foods, and yes, sexual activity. You didn't just abstain out of medical prudence. You abstained out of cosmic etiquette. If a man had sex with a menstruating woman, it was believed he risked contaminating himself and, by extension, the spaces he entered afterward. Some purification rites required days of fasting and even temporary isolation to scrub off the metaphysical residue. And you thought awkward period sex just meant washing the sheets. But the web goes deeper. In certain rural customs, entire households practiced abstinence during a woman's menstruation, whether she wanted to or not. Not just her partner, her whole family. This wasn't out of shame, but in a strange form of solidarity. You imagine a household tiptoeing around their eldest daughter's cycle like she's a walking solar eclipse. The mood shifts. Meals change. Fires are lit in specific ways to ward off wandering spirits attracted to blood. Some even believed fox spirits, trickster creatures with a love for chaos, prowled during menstrual periods, especially if a woman dared have sex in defiance of tradition. A tryst could turn into a curse, and in a land where foxes sometimes wore human faces. Who could tell? Historians still argue whether these restrictions empowered or isolated women. Some view them as tools of gendered control, others as inadvertent grants of rest, one of the only times women could escape the endless labor of care and housework under the banner of ritual impurity. One thing's for sure, sex was not an option. In court records, even concubines of the emperor had to report their cycles, and were rotated out of intimacy duty accordingly. You picture a ledger of blood, with names and dates, maintained by eunuchs who probably had way too much time on their hands. Now, let's stir in bath days. This might seem innocent until you realize that bathing in ancient Japan wasn't a daily habit. It was a ritual, a deliberate purification act, often performed in temples, streams, or communal bathhouses. Certain days were designated as you-know-high bath days when the moon was right, and the body could be cleansed without drawing in spiritual interference. These days also overlapped with abstinence days. The logic: if your body is being spiritually cleaned, you shouldn't immediately mess it up by doing the horizontal kabuki. Sex, even within marriage, was considered a contact act, capable of transferring impurities, even after a bath. Some manuals advised waiting a full day after bathing before engaging in intercourse. You're clean, yes, but not ritually stable. There's a famous story in the Shoku Nihongi, one of Japan's oldest historical records, about a prince who insisted on bedding his favorite concubine immediately after her bath. The next morning, his nose started bleeding uncontrollably, a classic sign of cosmic offense. He reportedly fasted for 3 days. Then it offered a ritual apology by donating 12 bolts of silk to a temple. You can't help but wonder what the concubine thought of all this. Maybe she just rolled her eyes and reached for another peach. Tonight's sex story comes from the Kama Sutra. Yes, India, but remember that knowledge flowed along trade routes like perfume, and it tells of a Japanese monk who traveled to learn about tantric practices. When he returned, he tried to introduce a more spiritually fluid view of sex to his home temple. Unfortunately, his experiments clashed with existing Shinto taboos. He was accused of disrespecting bath customs and was ordered to live in a cave for 7 years. His legacy: a small sect of monks who believed sexual energy could cleanse rather than pollute. They were later banned. The cave, however, became a pilgrimage site for lovers seeking fertility blessings. You can still visit it. Bring flowers, maybe a snack. As for fringe tidbits, let's talk about hair. Yes, hair. During certain band days, women were advised not to wash or comb their hair, as doing so might stir the spirits watching over their blood cycles. It sounds wild, but hair was seen as a conductor, an antenna to spiritual energies. On bath and band days, leaving it unkempt signaled humility and alignment with cosmic modesty. One old woman told a wandering monk that combing her hair on a red-marked day once led to a snake appearing in her bath water. She took it as a sign. From then on, she tied her hair with red string every band day. Some say her house smelled of roses and earth until she died at 103. So where does that leave you? Tonight, lying there on a blood-bathed, bath-blocked, calendar-cursed evening. You're not allowed to bathe. You're not allowed to have sex. Your hair probably shouldn't be braided. And even your own thoughts might need censoring. Because the real rule, hiding in all of this, the unspoken layer beneath the blood and soap and silk, is that discipline is sacred. Time itself is holy. You don't get to rush into intimacy just because you're in the mood. You wait. You track the moon. You check your partner's cycle and your ruler's health, and whether the foxes have been howling lately. You begin to realize how desire, shaped by these rules, becomes both more fragile and more precious. Lovers didn't just want each other, they anticipated each other. The longing, stretched over days of prohibition, made the eventual reunion not just physical, but spiritual. Letters passed, dreams noted, perfume applied carefully on wrists but left untouched. It was foreplay by calendar. And when at last the stars aligned and the red days passed, intimacy returned like spring after a long frost. You imagine the breath held in, released, a body finally touched, a spirit finally safe. The rules seem absurd now, distant, quaint, but the emotions they preserved, the rituals they enforced, still whisper under your skin. Maybe you don't believe in fox spirits or nosebleeds as cosmic warnings, but you know what it's like to wait for someone, to long for the right moment, to hold back, not out of fear, but respect. And when that moment comes, then it's not just sex, it's a blessing. You wake to a breeze lifting the edge of your curtain, carrying in the distant rhythm of temple bells. Another day, another red circle on the scroll by the door. You already know what it means without checking. It's Sweet Tachi, first day of the lunar month, the day where you absolutely, categorically, no matter how cute your partner looks eating rice cakes, cannot have sex. No exceptions. No loopholes. It doesn't matter if you're in love, married, or merely bored. On Sweet Tachi, even the thought of intimacy is seen as inviting disaster. You sigh, pull your robe tighter, and resign yourself to a night of intense, government-mandated self-control. The origin of Sweet Tachi abstinence traces back to the belief that beginnings are sacred. The first day of anything month, season, ritual is energetically raw and spiritually open. The cosmos is resetting itself, and your body is supposed to align with that rhythm, not interrupt it by mingling fluids. You're expected to be clean, restrained, focused. Lust, even consensual, is a form of disruption. And so, like clockwork, every new moon resets not just the sky, but your libido. The rule is as fixed as gravity. No touch, no thrust, not even a kiss if you want to follow tradition to the letter. And people did follow it. In some villages, shrine priests would patrol neighborhoods to ensure compliance not with sticks, but with scrolls, gongs, and the ever-potent threat of social shame. One story from the Edo period tells of a couple who forgot the date and were caught mid-embrace by a neighbor's grandmother, who screamed, "The moon has no shadow yet, and neither should your bedsheets." They were forced to donate rice to the local temple as penance and forbidden from attending the next harvest festival. You imagine that kind of punishment today, missing out on the communal barbecue because your timing was off. Historians still argue whether Tsuitachi bans were rooted more in Shinto cosmology or state control. After all, when the ruling class dictates your sex life on a monthly basis, it's hard not to see politics at play. But many believed deeply that misbehaving on this specific day could sour not just your month, but your entire year. One wrong move on the first, and the spirits might mark you as unstable. Think of it like forgetting your partner's birthday only, instead of icy glares. You get unlucky crops, sick livestock, or a sudden rash that no herbal remedy can fix. One emperor reportedly refused to speak on tsuitachi unless absolutely necessary. He would write notes instead, believing that even vocalizing impurity could spoil the sacred start. His consorts weren't even allowed near his chambers. On the night before tsuitachi, he would sleep alone, bathed in cedar smoke, wrapped in white linen, and wake to silence. You picture him lying there, majestic and lonely, trying not to sneeze lest the gods think him weak. That's one way to enforce celibacy, wrap it in divinity and dry-cleaned robes. Tonight's sex story features an ironic twist. From Sex with Kings, we get the tale of a Japanese prince during the Nara period who fell for a court lady with an uncanny memory. She could recite calendar omens from heart, and once corrected a senior priest on the correct lunar cycle. Impressed, he pursued her. But their affair hit a bump every time he tried to visit her on a tsuitachi. She refused, even slamming her chamber door once with a dramatic poem attached, "The moon is born. Let no hand mar its cradle." His solution: he changed the calendar, just once, quietly. His scribes altered one day's label in his court copy, so their tryst wouldn't technically fall on tsuitachi. She never forgave him. They say she married a poet and retired to a mountain villa where she wrote calendar-based erotica. A woman of principle and timing, even for commoners. Tsuitachi wasn't taken lightly. Some folk traditions said that children conceived on the first day of the lunar month would grow up directionless, as if born into the world without a map. Other tales insisted that such children would be born with blank eyes. Not literally, but eyes that didn't sparkle, as if the gods forgot to finish painting them. You picture a superstitious mother cradling her newborn, whispering apologies for a mistimed embrace. The fringe tidbit of this section is the use of tsuitachi incense. This rare blend of crushed chrysanthemum, riverbed clay, and dried persimmon was burned in some homes to ward off sexual desire. Not permanently, just for one night. You'd light the stick, place it under the bed, and let the aroma anchor the spirits of restraint. Couples who couldn't trust themselves were known to sleep on separate floors or with a child between them. You imagine that child growing up thinking they were the reason their parents never touched. Later, therapy explains it was all chrysanthemum smoke and lunar anxiety. There's a curious debate in Peter Webb's research over whether these rituals actually decreased sexual activity or simply redirected it. One fringe theory suggests that tsuitachi encouraged dream intimacy, lucid dreams, shared fantasies, spiritual encounters in sleep. Court diaries mention lovers meeting in mist on such nights, awakening refreshed but untouched. The boundary between desire and duty blurred in dreams, which the gods, it was assumed, could not punish. You're safe in the subconscious, so long as your hands stay above the blanket. And then there's the bathhouse workaround. In certain urban areas, couples would go together to public bathhouses on tsuitachi, under the guise of ritual purification. While physical intimacy was publicly forbidden, private corners, shadowed steam, and hushed gestures allowed for subtle exchanges. A shared glance, a folded towel handed with meaning, a whispered poem over the hot water's hiss. Nothing happened technically, but the heat of the water was no match for the heat of waiting. You begin to realize that tsuitachi wasn't about abstinence alone. It was about synchronization. A society choosing to pause, an agreement, however strained, to begin again from a place of calm. Even those who found it inconvenient respected it as a collective breath, a resetting of the soul, like New Year's Eve every month, except instead of champagne. You got pine incense and spiritual frustration, and now you, lying here on your own modern suitachi, feel a thread pulling you back to that shared ritual. You can almost smell the incense, feel the quiet press of expectation, the slow hush of restraint. It's not about guilt, it's about rhythm, a chance to step back, to align, to remember that not every urge needs release. Some just need acknowledgement, and perhaps, just for tonight, that's enough. You're standing barefoot in a hallway of polished wood, clutching a gift wrapped in violet cloth, heart thudding with excitement only to be stopped by a stoic-faced maid who bows and murmurs. It is an inauspicious day. That's all she says. No further explanation. Just that. You bow, back away, and the door shuts with a sigh of finality. Your romantic intentions delayed. Again. Welcome to the uniquely frustrating dance of love in ancient Japan, where weddings didn't just depend on emotions or arrangements, they were governed by cosmic bureaucracy. You don't just get married when it's convenient. You get married when the calendar allows it, and sometimes that means waiting. Weeks, months, even longer. In the courtly and elite circles of Heian-era Japan, marriage wasn't a one-day affair. It was a drawn-out, delicate series of steps involving strategic letters, coordinated gifts, ritual visits, and, finally, a formal union that could only occur on a day astrologers deemed auspicious. And they were picky. Certain dates were universally avoided: red days, band days, days following death in the family, days of planetary misalignment, days when the moon's arc slanted in an unfavorable direction. If your wedding fell on one of these, it was believed your union would be cursed infertility, infidelity, or early widowhood. Nothing says romance like a priest peeking at the moon and saying, "Try again next spring, next." Historians still argue whether these restrictions were genuinely believed or just a convenient way for families to stall or sabotage unwanted unions. Imagine a high-born daughter in love with a lower-ranking poet. Her parents don't say no outright, they simply insist on waiting for a proper date, which somehow never arrives. Meanwhile, the poor poet burns through all his good metaphors and ends up writing tragic haikus about plum blossoms and rejection. The formal wedding, when it did happen, was choreographed like theater. Candles were lit at specific times. The bride wore layers of robes chosen according to the season, her family's status, and, of course, the date. Even the direction she traveled from her parents' home to the groom's mattered. On unlucky days, couples were told to walk backward over the threshold to confuse the demons. You picture two newlyweds shuffling into their home in reverse, like sleep-deprived ghosts trying not to jinx their honeymoon. You can't make this stuff up except someone did, centuries ago, and everyone else nodded and agreed. Tonight's sex story brings us a brief but unforgettable entry from Sex with Kings. A nobleman once fell desperately in love with a commoner's daughter, and against all sense and social standing, she was allowed to marry into court. But the wedding date was delayed again and again due to astrological concerns. Finally, one night, overcome by frustration, he visited her chambers in secret. Their union was unblessed, their timing forbidden. A month later, she died. He was inconsolable and wrote this in his journal. "I entered her at the wrong moment, and the stars took her back. Whether from illness, shame, or court sabotage, no one knows, but her story lives on in ghost tales as a warning. don't love outside the lines. And definitely don't do it off calendar. What's fascinating is how deeply the wedding rules bled into everyday courtship. It wasn't just the ceremony. Every milestone had a corresponding calendar concern. First visits, first letters, first touches. Each one could only occur when the omen said yes. In some households, daughters were taught from childhood to memorize the 6-day rokuyo cycle, a traditional calendar where days are labeled as lucky or unlucky, even modern Japanese weddings. By the way, still sometimes check this system, because bad luck is like glitter centuries later. It still clings to everything. The fringe tidbit here is the wedding banana. No, not a euphemism. In certain regions, a real banana was placed beside the wedding bed on auspicious nights, symbolizing fertility and divine favor. If it ripened well over the next 3 days, the marriage was blessed. If it blackened or burst, it was considered a bad omen. Some families replaced the banana with a yam, just in case the fruit market was cursed that week. Either way, your marital fate could hinge on a piece of produce. You start to understand why people were anxious. But the irony is, the more they restricted weddings, the more inventive lovers became. Some eloped under cover of night, choosing their own lucky days based on personal dreams or shared symbols. One court record mentions a couple who got married on the anniversary of their first letter exchange, even though it was astrologically disastrous. 10 years later, they were still together, unlucky by the stars, lucky by love. Their story became a popular play in the Edo period. Audience members cried and clutched charms wrapped in silk for courage. And here's the kicker. Even consummation was timed. After the wedding, the couple couldn't always have sex immediately. Certain nights were still marked as too hot, too cold, or too spiritually thin. One diary records a groom being gently told by the priest that he must wait 3 days to allow spiritual membranes to thicken. The groom complied, then reportedly snuck into the bride's quarters wearing a mask shaped like a fox and made her laugh so hard she forgot the rules. They both confessed later and were given ritual laughter penance. You're not sure what that is, but it sounds like a good time. Michel Foucault might say this is how power creeps into the most intimate corners of life. Not through brute force, but through rituals so embedded in your identity that you don't even see them as control. You think you're choosing when to marry, when to touch, when to speak, but it's the calendar that chooses. You're just playing your part, reading from a script written in stars and temple smoke. As you lie there tonight, far from arranged marriages and symbolic bananas, you start to feel the strange comfort of those ancient rules. The sense that someone or something is watching the patterns, making sure no step is taken out of turn. It's rigid, yes, but it's also poetic. Love, in this world, isn't impulsive. It's an art form, structured, timed, laced with silk and silence and longing. And maybe, just maybe, all that waiting made the love deeper, like a tea that needs time to steep. You don't rush the first sip. You savor it, eyes closed, heart open, knowing you've waited for exactly the right day. You find yourself squinting through mist as the path winds uphill, gravel crunching under your sandals. The forest is dense, the trees ancient, and somewhere ahead, a bell tolls. It's cold, quiet, and sacred. You're on the road to one of Japan's sacred mountains, and whether you're a monk, a pilgrim, or just someone who got dragged here by your cousin with a bad conscience, one thing is clear up here. Sex is off the table. Completely. Not just because the hike has your legs jellified, but because the mountains don't permit it. Not in thought, not in word, and definitely not in deed. Up here, The gods don't just frown at intimacy, they smite. Sacred mountains like Mount Koya and Mount Omen weren't just sites for spiritual retreat, they were full-on abstinence zones. Entire swaths of land considered too pure for the stain of human desire. Monks trained here in isolation, fasting, meditating, and chanting sutras to empty their minds and bodies of worldly attachment. And nothing, absolutely nothing, was more worldly than sex. These weren't just monks saying no thanks to temptation. These were men, and sometimes women, throwing themselves into landscapes where even a lustful thought could be enough to require immediate ritual cleansing. You imagine lying on a thin futon in a freezing hut, your only company the wind, your stomach growling, and trying very hard not to remember the nice-smelling traveler from the village inn. Good luck. Historians still argue whether these abstinence rules were taken literally or symbolically, but the records show clear enforcement. Signs at trail entrances warned travelers. No women beyond this point. Some trails had detour paths just for female pilgrims. The idea wasn't misogyny, though. Let's be honest. It played a role. It was about preserving the purity of the training ground. Female bodies, particularly those menstruating, were believed to disturb the mountain's spiritual equilibrium. One monk wrote that a woman's presence stirred the wind and confused the chants. You roll your eyes. But also note that men were told to abstain too, even from masturbation. Impure thoughts not allowed. Wet dreams, bring a bucket of salt and start chanting. The rules went further than mere personal discipline. Some monasteries conducted nightly inspections. Monks were expected to lie straight, hands visible, faces uncovered. If a novice shifted too much or whispered in his sleep, he might be woken and asked to recite a verse. You imagine being jolted awake by a candle shoved in your face and having to mumble scripture with a dry mouth and guilty dreams still fresh in your head. Talk about performance anxiety. There were even reports of small wooden cages used to restrict sleeping positions, preventing physical contact, even accidental, with oneself or others. This wasn't celibacy. This was abstinence warfare. One of the more extreme examples comes from the 10th century monk, Enno Gyoja, often credited with founding Shugendo, a syncretic religion that emphasized mountain asceticism. He believed in training the body through harsh exposure, starvation, and sexual denial. His disciples were required to hike barefoot, bathe in freezing waterfalls, and survive for days with only water and rice while chanting sutras. Sex absolutely forbidden. One story tells of a disciple who confessed to having a sensual dream after looking at a plum blossom. His punishment was to hike the mountain blindfolded, relying only on prayer to find his way. He survived, but was said to speak only in metaphors afterward. You decide that sounds either wise or deeply traumatized. Tonight's sex story comes from The Erotic Spirit Through History, where a temple scribe recounts a secret relationship between two monks during a rainy summer on Mount Hiei. The older monk, respected for his chanting voice, would leave coded notes written on mulberry leaves. The younger monk, new to the order and still untrained in restraint, eventually cracked under longing. They met in the bell tower, shared only a kiss, and were caught. Rather than expulsion, the elder monk was ordered into a 10-year silence vow. He later became renowned for his writing, but never spoke again. Historians are still unsure whether he remained celibate afterward or simply mastered a higher form of secrecy. Then there are the mountain festivals, like the fire rituals of Mount Omin, where men proved their devotion by walking across burning coals. Participation required total abstinence for at least 7 days beforehand. and failure to comply was believed to cause burns or collapse mid-walk. There's a tale of a merchant who cheated the rule his wife had just returned from a long trip and, well, he slipped. He tried the firewalk anyway. Midway through, the coals popped, and he fainted. The priests didn't say a word. They just carried him to the purification pool and dropped him in fully clothed. Lesson learned. Fringe tidbit for tonight: celibacy amulets. Monks and travelers alike wore charms sewn into their garments or tucked inside belt pouches. Small carved tokens depicting lotus flowers. Locked gates or closed eyes. These weren't magic per se, but reminders. Spiritual chastity seatbelts, if you will, if temptation struck. The idea was to touch the charm, breathe, and recall your vow. One rare charm unearthed from a collapsed hermitage featured an image of two foxes asleep, symbolizing unfulfilled longing and harmony through restraint. A poetic way to say, keep it in your pants. Michel Foucault's influence flickers here too. His idea that bodies in such systems aren't repressed but sculpted by power. The monk's body wasn't just denied pleasure. It was reshaped into a symbol, a container for discipline. Every choice, what to eat, how to sleep, when to speak, was laced with sublimation. And in that denial, a strange power emerged. Some monks were said to radiate ki-hiki-bi, a spiritual force so strong it could calm animals and repel sickness. You don't get that from scrolling through late-night woodblock prints. You get that from not scrolling at all. Of course, not everyone followed the rules. Some monasteries had secret tunnels. Others tolerated concubines disguised as kitchen helpers. There's a letter from the Kamakura period where one abbot writes in code to a friend. The incense here is strong, and the tea girls brew it well. Translation: the sex ban was, occasionally, selectively enforced, especially for those with money or connections, which proves once again where rules exist, so do loopholes, even at 10,000 feet elevation. And yet, as you lie here, imagining yourself swaddled in robes, heart thudding with breath slowed by meditation, there's something almost seductive about the stillness. The idea that desire doesn't have to be chased, but observed, held, transmuted into clarity. You don't need to act. You only need to witness. The mountain doesn't tempt. It mirrors. And in that reflection, you see not weakness, but discipline wrapped in longing, which, in its own way, is a different kind of intimacy. You sit in a quiet chamber, the tatami mats beneath you warm from the afternoon sun, and in your lap lies a scroll neatly rolled, sealed with red wax, and stamped with imperial authority. It's not a love letter. It's a code, a constitution. In fact, you unroll it slowly, expecting lofty ideals about peace or rice taxes, but instead, nestled between edicts about moral conduct and reverence for Buddha, is a subtle but firm command: control yourself. And not just in public. In bed, too. Welcome to Japan's earliest flirtation with codified virtue, the 17-article Constitution, where governance, religion, and sex all share a bed, whether they want to or not. Drafted in the early 7th century under Prince Shotoku, this document was less about law in the modern sense and more about shaping behavior, a hybrid of Confucian order, Buddhist ethics, and budding imperial identity. It emphasized harmony, respect, obedience, and restraint. You read it and realize these weren't just guidelines for court officials. These were marching orders for the soul. And desire. Well, it was something to be measured, moderated, and, when possible, postponed. Not banned outright, but certainly watched. A lot. One particular article, number 2, encourages reverence for Buddhist teachings, which, as anyone familiar with monastic codes knows, meant abstaining from sex entirely if you wanted real spiritual credibility, even for the non-clergy. The implication was clear. Virtue begins with restraint. If the body is a temple, then uncontrolled desire is graffiti on the sacred walls. Historians still argue whether this article was meant to impose actual sexual restrictions on common citizens, or simply offer moral advice. But the ripple effect was real. Temples enforced celibacy. Courts rewarded it. And entire families began to track not just who slept with whom, but when, how, and under what lunar conditions. This constitutional blending of moral and administrative power made sex part of statecraft. Suddenly, bedroom behavior wasn't private. It was a reflection of one's alignment with the larger cosmic and political order. You weren't just being asked to behave. You were being drafted into a collective choreography of chastity. One out-of-sync step, and the entire empire might wobble. That's a lot of pressure on your groin, and this idea only intensified with time. By the Nara and Heian periods, further administrative codes like the Taiho Ritsuryo began explicitly outlining acceptable sexual behavior for various classes, particularly within court and temple life. Some temples issued handbooks advising monks how to avoid temptation strategies, included cold baths, late-night sutra chanting, and, oddly enough, extremely bland food. Apparently, if your rice is boring enough, your libido follows suit. Tonight's sex story comes from a lesser-known court document that recounts the tale of a scholar named Minamoto no Tameyuki, who swore an oath to abstain from sex during his final exams, because failing would dishonor his family name. For 6 months, he wore a belt inscribed with Buddhist prayers and avoided even looking at women. But one night, after seeing a court lady drop a poem scroll and bend to pick it up, he lost his concentration. They met secretly that evening, breaking both his vow and Article 6, which forbade acts of disorder among students. He failed the exam. His punishment: transcribing 1,000 verses of the Lotus Sutra by hand while standing. You imagine the cramps, the regret, and the slow realization that perhaps he should have invested in stronger prayer belts. The Constitution's reach extended beyond moral encouragement. It shaped social expectations. Marriages had to align not just with family strategy, but state-sanctioned virtue. Concubines were carefully monitored, not only for status, but for timing. Some court families reportedly paid astrologers handsomely to determine which nights were spiritually clear for procreation, lest their child inherit unclean energy. You imagine a wealthy noble pausing mid-foreplay to consult a scroll. Passion meets bureaucracy. Again. The fringe tidbit in this section is the ritual of mouth fasting. No, it's not dental. During spiritually significant weeks tied to imperial observances or court anniversaries, participants, mostly in elite circles, would abstain from sex, rich food, and even certain words. Saying desire, enter, or heat was taboo. If spoken, these words had to be purified by whispering them into a bowl of ash. You picture a lady in waiting cursing under her breath, then running off to find a bowl like she just dropped an F-bomb in the palace library. What Michel Foucault observed in European monastic life is echoed here. Power moves through rituals of control, embedding itself not just in what you do, but in how you think and speak. Japan's constitutional beginnings weren't just about taxes and loyalty. They were about interior alignment. The idea that your inner world, your urges, especially, must mirror the order and harmony of the state. Sex, in that context, wasn't just biological. It was political theater, a quiet rebellion, or a silent nod to conformity. And yet, for all this pressure, people still found ways to subvert the code. Lovers disguised their liaisons as poetry exchanges, coded their lust into seasonal metaphors, and used temple visits as covers for romantic rendezvous. Some men joined the clergy for social mobility, but continued secret affairs. One letter from the Heian period shows a monk apologizing to his lover for violating the sacred order of breath and bone. Poetic and damning. Still, others took the code to heart, finding in its constraints a kind of peace. One noblewoman wrote that abstaining during temple observances made her feel clean in the eyes of the gods, even though she missed her husband terribly. Another diary, written by a lower official, describes how he and his wife used abstinence weeks to write erotic dreams instead of acting them out. They would read them to each other, laughing, whispering, and pretending the gods couldn't hear. You can almost hear their voices now, soft in the lamplight, weaving intimacy from imagination. As you lie here tonight, the idea of a constitution shaping your desires might seem absurd. But there's something undeniably elegant about the way ancient Japan wove law and love into a single thread. No part of life was exempt from meaning. Even your urges were part of a larger harmony. You weren't just resisting for the sake of rules. You were resisting because that resistance itself was sacred. A vow, a discipline, a song hummed beneath your breath as you folded your hands and waited, not because you had to, but because the stars and the state had agreed not yet. And maybe, just maybe, that pause made the eventual yes all the sweeter. You find yourself in a lacquered hallway of the imperial palace, moonlight sliding across the floor like spilled milk. Behind delicate sliding doors, laughter murmurs, silks rustle, and a faint note of perfume, maybe plum blossom, lingers in the air. You think of Heian court life, usually romanticized with soft focus imagery, robed lovers writing poems to each other, midnight visits across moats, flirtations that stretch over seasons. But what gets glossed over is this. These paragons of elegance were often operating under a list of ritual sex bans longer than a scroll of family genealogy. Even at the peak of their sensual artistry, they were dodging landmines of calendar taboo. Being aristocratic didn't mean being free. It meant performing desire within a framework of strict, often contradictory, ritual rules. At the center of this pageant stood the court aristocrats. The kugi obsessed with appearances, propriety, and timing. They lived in a culture where reputation was shaped less by what you did and more by when you did it. A romantic affair was only scandalous if the moon was wrong. And physical intimacy, that was acceptable so long as it didn't overlap with purification days, death anniversaries, emperor illness, certain lunar cycles, or any number of astrological no-nos. Sex wasn't forbidden. It was scheduled like poetry readings. You had to be both bold and extremely good at checking calendars. You didn't just ask. Are you free tonight, you asked? Is the cosmos? Historians still argue whether this obsession with timing reflected genuine belief in celestial power, or just became social code, an elegant excuse for aristocrats to slow down courtship, deflect unwanted advances, or stall political alliances wrapped in marital sheets. It was less about moral panic and more about ceremonial rhythm. The bedroom was another room in the palace of propriety. A nobleman might prepare weeks for a visit to a lady's chamber. His messenger would deliver a poem, to which she might reply with another, perhaps quoting a flower's bloom or the texture of morning dew indicating her openness or refusal. If things aligned emotionally, poetically, astrologically, he'd make his move. And yet, even then, a priest might declare the day unclean. Or worse, her lady-in-waiting might remind them both that it was an abstinence day. Desire would have to simmer. A kettle just under boil, one famous diary. The Pillow Book by Sei Shonagon is full of passing references to these restrictions. She rarely names them outright because everyone at court already knew. If she says a lover turned away because of the calendar, no explanation needed. It wasn't weird. It was protocol. You imagine trying to flirt over tea while a court official quietly consults a lunar almanac in the corner. Lovely poem, Lord Sadafusa. But unfortunately today is Kimonbi, the unlucky spirit day. Try again next week. Tonight's sex story comes from a quieter scandal buried in the Eiga Monogatari, a court tale describing how a junior consort of the emperor fell out of favor not because of infidelity, but because she seduced him during a prohibited mourning period. Her rivals pounced, and though the emperor forgave her, she was reassigned to a remote villa for reflection and purification. She spent 3 years there, writing waka poetry and growing medicinal herbs. One of her surviving poems reads, "My body may be banished, but my scent still lingers in the folds of his robe." Subtle, devastating, and undoubtedly written on clean calendar days. But let's be clear. Abstinence didn't mean abstention from desire. If anything, the delays intensified it. Aristocrats cultivated longing the way one might cultivate orchids. Carefully, tenderly, with a heavy dose of metaphor. On forbidden nights, lovers sent fans painted with suggestive symbols mountains, rippling streams, birds poised mid-flight. If a fan was returned closed, the answer was no. If returned open, it meant, "Meet me on a safe night." The fan, not the flesh, did the talking. The fringe tidbit of tonight is the use of color codes in Heian-era layering robes, known as junihitoe. Women's robe layers had symbolic color pairings based on seasons and, yes, auspicious dates. Wearing an incorrect color combination on a sex ban day was a social faux pas, akin to showing up to a funeral in sequins. One record notes a lady being laughed out of a moon viewing party for wearing willow and plum a spring pairing during an autumn abstinence week. She claimed she was colorblind. Historians suspect shade. Interestingly, men, too, had clothing-based cues. Certain headgear, like the kanmuri, indicated that the wearer was observing ritual purification. If a man showed up at your quarters with a high-ridged hat, he might just be here to talk. If he wore his casual court cap, slightly tilted. However, that was a coded "I'm available." It was all about angles. Even foreplay was geometrical. Yet, even with all the restrictions, people got creative. One courtier built a secret passage between his villa and his lover's quarters, timing visits for the brief windows between ban periods. He was eventually caught, not during the act, but when a minor earthquake exposed the tunnel. He claimed it was for spiritual consultations. The priest investigating him reportedly replied, "The only spirit you consulted was lust. You have to admire the dedication." Though, stonework and seduction rarely mix so elegantly. Michel Foucault would say that power doesn't just repress, it produces. And here, we see that in full effect. The restrictions didn't kill passion. They redirected it, created a game of coded glances, layered poems, and intricate dance steps where the moment of union, when it finally came, was elevated to something nearly sacred. You weren't just lovers. You were conspirators against the stars. And that's the strange charm of it all. These aristocrats, draped in silks and drowning in etiquette, weren't cold fish. They were smoldering embers, waiting for the right gust. They respected the bands not because they feared punishment, but because they had turned waiting into an art form. Every delayed night, every postponed touch, was another verse added to the poem of longing. So tonight, as you lie back, think of them not as repressed elites, but as composers of suspense. Think of hands reaching under silk, only to pause. Think of eyes meeting across moonlit corridors, only to glance away. Think of all the poetry written not because they couldn't act, but because they weren't allowed to yet. And maybe, just maybe, remember that sometimes the sweetest moments are those suspended in time, hanging just before the touch. You press your ear to a paper wall, heart racing with curiosity, maybe a little envy, listening for something forbidden. Soft laughter, the rustle of robes, the low cadence of a whispered name. But instead, you hear silence, not the peaceful kind, the official kind, the kind that says someone is choosing to wait. Because inside that chamber sits a court lady, not alone exactly, but untouched. Her lover sent a poem. She replied. He came, and then nothing. Because tonight is not a night for touching. It's a night marked in red ink on a chart folded neatly beside her inkstone. This is a story of patience so practiced it became policy how women inside the palace didn't just follow the rules. They kept them, managed them, lived by them, and sometimes manipulated them inside the imperial palace, where intrigue hung in the air, heavier than incense. Women held far more power than the outside world gave them credit for. They weren't merely vessels of beauty or obedience, they were the calendar keepers. In an era where touching the wrong person on the wrong day could mean exile, demotion, or ritual disgrace. These women became experts at reading the signs. They tracked moon phases, menstrual cycles, imperial observances, and the subtle shifts in favor that swirled around the emperor like pollen in spring. They knew which nights were safe, which were dangerous, and which could be leveraged. Historians still argue whether these women were strictly enforcers of abstinence or quietly resisting through coded action. But diaries and pillow books hint at a truth sharper than any official record within their painted sleeves, and reserved glances was a machinery of timing, memory, and calculation. Being unavailable wasn't always a divine decree. Sometimes it was strategy. A red day could be genuine, or it could be an excuse to avoid a suitor without losing face. You weren't rejecting him, you were protecting him. From the gods, from impurity, from yourself. Consider this inside the palace. The emperor's consorts were ranked, not just by favor, but by timing. The primary consort might be scheduled for ceremonial nights, while others rotated based on fertility calculations, omens, and even political pressure. But the real power often lay with the one who controlled the record. There's a tale of a woman named Lady Reishi, a mid-ranked consort whose beauty was said to fade in light, but bloom in shadow. She maintained her status not by seducing the emperor every night, but by controlling access. She kept track of every inauspicious date, whispered reminders to his attendants, and timed her refusals to coincide with red days. She was so consistent that when she did invite him, it was seen as fate, rather than flirtation. They say he fathered 3 children with her, all conceived during clear sky nights, none of them on a calendar blemished by misfortune. Coincidence? Probably not. Tonight's sex story, pulled from Sex with Kings, tells of a Heian-era lady-in-waiting who found herself caught between 2 rivals, her official patron and a younger poet with whom she had fallen in love. The court was aware of her dilemma. She used the calendar like a shield, refusing both on alternating ban nights, claiming ritual impurity and letting the tension stretch. Eventually, she chose the poet, but only after the senior noble was reassigned to another province. Her refusal was never scandalous. It was sacred, and in this way, she rewrote her fate using a tool every woman in her circle had mastered: the power of knowing when to say no. Among the fringe customs practiced inside the palace was moonbathing. On abstinence nights, women would sit under the open sky, cloaked but barefoot, to let the moonlight purify their longing. It sounds poetic, even lovely, until you realize it was also surveillance. Attendants kept track of who bathed in which moon phase, which direction they faced, and whether their presence corresponded with known liaisons. You weren't just gazing at the moon, you were performing chastity. One wrong tilt of the head, one lingering gaze toward the wrong wing of the palace, and rumors bloomed like mold on damp scrolls. To avoid scandal, women often coordinated with their chambermaids, who served as both confidants and schedule enforcers. If a suitor arrived on a red-marked night, the maid might simply state, "My lady is reciting sutras tonight," and hand him a sprig of camellia, the flower of longing, but also of delay. In some cases, maids even maintained separate ledgers of safe nights for multiple suitors, ensuring no overlap, no confrontation, and always an alibi. You imagine one such maid, elbow-deep in incense wrappers and hair combs, quietly running the empire from a side room with nothing but her mistress's schedule and impeccable memory. And let's not forget the written word. Women in the palace were masters of euphemism. On red nights, their poetry hinted at distance, fog, unbloomed flowers, and cool winds. On green light nights, metaphors shifted, rivers broke their banks, cranes returned to nests, jasmine buds burst open. It was eroticism through seasonal metaphor, timing woven into longing like gold thread through silk. One poem found tucked between a lady's robes read, "Tonight, the stars are covered in veils. My body follows suit. Elegant, cryptic, legally safe." Michel Foucault might argue that in such systems, power becomes internalized, and the governed enforce the rules themselves. But here, something more subversive was happening. The women weren't just enforcing, they were curating, guiding, editing. They were both the audience and the director of their own romantic theater. The calendar didn't just tell them when they couldn't act. It told them when they could, strategically, safely, triumphantly. The fringe tidbit for this section is a strange item called the moon bell. A small charm said to emit a faint chime when held close to the abdomen on forbidden nights. If it rang, the user was protected from pregnancy, the logic being that the body aligned with the moon's cycle was too spiritually full to conceive. Scientific? Absolutely not, but charming, in every sense. Some women wore them as pendants, others hid them in sleeves. One diary mentions a lady who kept hers under her pillow to ward off mischief from both dreams and men. So now, as you drift beneath your own sheets, far from imperial chambers and political suitors, think of them, these quiet power brokers in layered robes. The women who kept order through memory, restraint, and ritualized seduction. They didn't just survive the system, They ran it. With grace, with silence, and with a calendar tucked neatly in their sleeve. They knew every red day, every secret night, every trick of timing to turn abstinence into influence. And they did it all with a fan, a poem, and an unreadable smile. You're standing outside a painted screen door, a letter clutched tightly in your palm. Inside, you know she's waiting, sleeves arranged just so, incense burning low, eyes scanning the same moon as you. But you don't step inside. You can't. Because tonight the gods have said no. The calendar confirms it, and your own honor hisses at you like a wet rice kettle. Wait. So instead, you slide the letter under the door, bow deeply to no one in particular, and walk away with your heart screaming in iambic meter. Because if you can't touch, you'll write. And in ancient Japan, when sex was banned, poetry got downright steamy. In a world ruled by rituals and red-lettered prohibitions, love didn't disappear. It just went paper thin. Lovers found a workaround through ink, brush, and metaphor, building entire relationships on folded paper exchanged under moonlight. This wasn't just flirtation. This was high art, erotic communication by calligraphy, where one misplaced stroke could mean the difference between invitation and insult. You didn't say "I want you." You wrote, "The plum tree bends under early snow," and hoped they knew you meant "meet me tomorrow, when the stars permit." Historians still debate whether these letters were sincere expressions of longing or ritual performance. But the volume of preserved correspondence, thousands of fragments, poems, and coded messages suggests a society where eroticism was deeply literate. Sex wasn't silenced by the bans. It was translated. When touching was taboo, the pen became an extension of desire. And those letters weren't just read once. They were reread, annotated, even perfumed. There are documented cases of courtiers sleeping with love notes tucked into their robes, using them like romantic amulets to survive long periods of abstinence. One classic example comes from the tales of Ise, where a man forbidden to see his lover due to mourning restrictions sends her a poem folded into a sprig of iris. My sleeves are wet, not with rain, but with what I hold back. Her reply, written on a fan, reads, "Tonight, even the wind dares not cross the threshold." Neither of them broke the ban, but emotionally they might as well have. The palace elite weren't the only ones fluent in this literary foreplay. Even among lower-ranking samurai and court scribes, the ability to write a suggestive poem, one that respected taboos while dripping with subtext, was a prized skill. A man who couldn't wield a brush well was said to be impotent in the hand. Brutal, but fair. One military officer, known more for his sword than his syllables, paid a servant to ghostwrite his letters. When the lady discovered this, she sent back a blank sheet. The insult was so poetic, he reportedly took a vow of silence for a year. Tonight's sex story comes from the erotic spirit. Through history, and centers on a noblewoman whose husband was away at war during a month-long sex prohibition declared by the regional governor. Starved for touch, but not for wit. She wrote him a series of increasingly sensual poems about food, each one describing meals she wished he could taste. The final one simply read, "The rice is warm. The bowl is full. Come home before the broth cools." He arrived 3 days early, faked an illness to excuse his leave, and reportedly never looked at a soup bowl the same way again. Some letters weren't even written for the recipient's benefit. They were for the self. The act of writing became a ritual to channel and control desire. Much like Buddhist chanting, it was repetition as purification. One Heian diary describes a lady who denied her lover for over a month due to temple observances, wrote him a new poem every day, and burned each one in her incense brazier. She believed the smoke carried her longing to the gods without violating the ban, whether or not it worked. Her chamber always smelled faintly of sandalwood and yearning. The fringe tidbit for this section: erotic paper weights. Yes, really. Small, carved stones or polished wood pieces used to hold down love letters on breezy balconies. Some were shaped like lotus buds, others like sleeping foxes. A few cheekier versions featured tiny abstract carvings of entwined cranes, symbolic, obviously, but also unmistakable. Possessing one was a quiet signal I write. I wait. I want. What Michel Foucault called technologies of the self takes shape beautifully here, in a society where external forces regulated bodily acts. Internal disciplines like writing became ways to reassert agency. These weren't passive lovers trapped by red-letter dates. These were people reclaiming intimacy through craft, using language as the soft weapon of resilience. Ink was a way to say, I still choose you without breaking the rules, without triggering ritual shame, and often without touching at all. Some couples even created coded calendars, marking safe and forbidden days, not with ink, but with floral illustrations. A red camellia meant no, a white chrysanthemum soon, a pair of plum blossoms tonight, if the sky stays clear. These images were painted into the margins of books, onto the back of mirrors, and even embroidered into robe linings. Imagine unfastening your lover's sleeve and seeing your own message stitched there. Forbidden, yes, but unforgettable. Others used storytelling as disguise. One diary tells of a woman who wrote erotic fiction set centuries earlier, featuring star-crossed lovers in mythical kingdoms. Everyone knew who the characters were based on. Everyone read it, but no one could punish her. The names had been changed. The acts were fictional, and the timing always just past the last red day. That's what made it art. That's what. So tonight, as you lie there, hands still, thoughts wandering, you feel the ghosts of those letters brush past you like silk ribbons. You hear the rustle of paper, the scratch of brush on scroll, the rustling wind carrying unsent poems between bamboo screens. You imagine someone miles away doing the same, lips moving silently as they reread your words by candlelight, not touching themselves, not touching you, just letting the desire live inside the page, unspoken, but very much alive. And maybe that's the lesson. In a world where every touch had consequences, every word became more tender, more deliberate. A line of poetry could linger longer than skin. A refusal could feel like an invitation, and a single sentence, whispered at the right time, could warm a night colder than any abstinence decree. You stand beneath a cedar tree, the sky steel gray above you, and a war drum echoes faintly in the distance. A rider gallops past, armor rattling like loose coins, his hand clutching a scroll tighter than his sword. It's not a love letter. It's a military campaign order. But in his other sleeve, wrapped secretly in silk, is a list small, personal, and precious. Not of enemy targets, of red days, even on the battlefield. Far from temples and calendars, the samurai were not exempt. War could rage, cities could burn, but sex still bowed to the calendar. The Bushido code met its match not in blood, but in astrology and ritual. Samurai culture is often mythologized as nothing but swordsmanship and honor duels. But in truth, these warriors lived highly regimented lives. Discipline didn't stop at the dojo gate. It crept into their homes, their dreams, and their beds. Sex was allowed, sometimes even encouraged for marriage, for bonding, even for morale, but only if the timing was correct. Enter the seasonal dry spells, stretches of abstinence tied not to chastity, but to celestial caution. Certain days, months, or campaign seasons were declared off limits. And if you disobeyed, it wasn't just a breach of etiquette. It could be seen as a spiritual risk, a distraction, an opening for misfortune to creep through your armor. Historians still argue how widespread these sex restrictions were among samurai ranks. Some claim they were exaggerated by later chroniclers, trying to romanticize warrior discipline. Others point to detailed records, campaign logs, temple reports, and personal diaries that clearly outlined sex ban periods during pre-battle fasts, funerals, new moon phases, and seasonal transitions. One general reportedly enforced a 30-day abstinence rule before every siege. He believed it cleared the soul and sharpened the sword. You imagine his soldiers grumbling into their rice bowls, swearing not at the enemy, but at the red-inked scribbles dictating yet another month of cold futons. Let's get specific. During Obon, the Buddhist festival honoring ancestral spirits, sexual activity was discouraged even among married samurai. The logic ancestors were visiting, and you don't desecrate grandma's ghost visit by fooling around in the next room. One warlord built a separate sleeping lodge during Obon, far from his consort, and spent 3 nights fasting and reciting the Lotus Sutra. His men followed suit, whether out of devotion or fear. We'll never know. Some even slept in armor, claiming it was easier to resist temptation when wearing full metal trousers. Tonight's sex story comes from Sex with Kings, in a chapter examining the intersection of power, war, and abstinence. A high-ranking daimyo in the Sengoku period once broke a Red Day sex ban the night before a major battle. The next morning, his favored concubine was found ill. His horse refused to gallop, and a sudden rainstorm muddied the valley roads. Interpreting all 3 as divine punishment, he ordered a purification rite for his entire unit. The enemy attacked mid-ritual, and his forces were scattered. His legend lives on, not for his tactics, but for his line. It was not the enemy that undid us. It was my hunger. Fringe practice of the day. The warrior's talisman known as the kikenfuda, a small strip of inscribed paper tucked into armor, meant to ward off impure urges during campaign. Some had Buddhist mantras. Others had diagrams of the constellations aligned against lust. Soldiers who felt desire rising were instructed to press the charm to their chest and recite a specific verse. If that didn't work, some resorted to tying a thin cord around their thigh, tight enough to distract. Practical questionable. Effective enough to keep the ritualists happy, but even the hardest codes have loopholes. While heterosexual sex was regulated by astrology and calendar, same-sex relationships among samurai often existed in a separate space. These bonds, romantic, sexual, or both, were not always subject to the same strict bans. Whether due to omission, cultural blind spots, or deliberate flexibility. Some war diaries describe intimate companionship between male warriors during sex ban periods, treated as emotionally strengthening rather than disruptive. One even writes, "No woman's warmth can replace the clarity of a comrade's vow." That sentence has been debated for centuries. Erotic, platonic, ritualistically, euphemistic. Probably all 3, And then there were the post-battle indulgences. When campaigns ended, soldiers flooded hot springs and tea houses with a hunger not just for food and drink, but for touch. Towns near battlefields learned to read the rhythms of war, not just in terms of movement, but abstinence cycles. Some brothels even employed astrologers to mark red day gaps in warrior calendars and offer poetry nights instead of physical services. One brothel near Kyoto hosted dream readings, where patrons paid to have erotic dreams interpreted instead of fulfilled. A workaround. Certainly, but one that kept both clients and karma clean. Michel Foucault might observe here that the samurai body was a battlefield. In itself, a terrain constantly managed, disciplined, and redirected to serve a political moral ideal. Abstinence wasn't just a rule, it was a test. Could you deny yourself even in the presence of comfort, warmth, and the promise of pleasure? And if you could, what did that say about your capacity to deny the enemy on the battlefield? Restraint became reputation. A samurai who broke a sex ban was seen as loose in other areas. His sword hand shaky, his resolve soft. Even rumors of calendar violations could sink a warrior's standing faster than an ill-fated duel. But of course, desire is tricky. In one preserved letter, a samurai writes to his wife from the front lines, thanking her for not visiting during a restricted week, and then adding a postscript. Your absence was like the moon behind clouds. Felt, not seen, but heavy nonetheless. Romantic, absolutely. Frustrated, undeniably. Still obedient. Yeah. He kept the rules. He waited. But he also folded her last letter into a pocket over his heart, next to his charm, and reread it every morning before sharpening his blade. And so, as you lie still beneath your own layers tonight, think of them warriors in the rain, calendar in hand, hearts disciplined, but never dull. Think of the clash between steel and skin, between ritual and want. Think of all the longing penned under torches, all the cold nights made colder by belief. And maybe, just maybe, remember that even the strongest armor sometimes trembles, especially on nights marked in red. You're squatting by a fire, a rough bowl of millet porridge in your hands, staring into the orange flicker as old Auntie Hisa leans close to whisper something scandalous. Not scandalous like palace intrigue or samurai poetry. This is a farming village. After all, no calligraphy, no silk, just dirt, sweat, and survival. But her story grabs everyone's attention anyway. It's about a neighbor's daughter, a full moon, a broken taboo, and a baby born with webbed toes. She ignored the banned day, Hisa says, wide-eyed. Did it with her husband on a night the gods said no. Now the child swims better than he walks. The others murmur, nod, and you feel a chill that has nothing to do with the wind. Because here, even the poorest families obey the calendar, even if they can't read it. Among the peasantry of ancient Japan, farmers, fisherfolk, laborers, brewers, the concept of sex ban days wasn't filtered through elegant poetry or incense smoke. It came as oral tradition, ritual warnings, and simple rules passed down like family recipes. They didn't have access to imperial astrologers or official edicts, but they knew the basics. Some days were bad. Bad for planting, bad for traveling, and definitely bad for rolling around under the mosquito net. These were the danger days, and everyone knew them, even if the explanations were a bit fuzzy. The sun looked weird. No sex. Foxes cried all night. No sex. a neighbor's chicken laid a 2-yolk egg. Absolutely no sex. Historians still debate how uniformly these rural sex bans were enforced or believed. Some argue they were exaggerated later by moralistic reformers or Shinto priests trying to instill order. Others point to local shrine records, passed down almanacs, and even embroidery patterns on festival robes that mark specific taboo dates. The pattern was clear. Just because you lived in a thatched hut didn't mean the gods weren't watching. And if they were watching, best to keep it chaste, especially on the days marked with invisible ink and whispered warnings. One reason for the ban's agriculture. Life in the village revolved around planting and harvest cycles, and those cycles were heavily spiritualized. Certain planting days were believed to require the full strength of the household body and spirit. Sex on those days was thought to drain energy away from the soil, angering the rice kami. Even if you were done before dawn, the superstition lingered. People believed rice grew slower if it was sown after a night of passion. One folk song from the Tohoku region includes the line, "He sowed the seed, but spoiled the field, his wife's hips stole the spring." Poetic, passive-aggressive, and full of cultural anxiety. Another issue, illness. Sex during certain seasonal transitions, particularly between late summer and autumn, was considered risky. Village healers claimed it made you more susceptible to coughs, fevers, and what they vaguely called spirit chills. These weren't just excuses. There are records of entire households being quarantined, not for actual disease, but because the neighbors thought they'd broken a sex ban during a liminal festival. Social enforcement was brutal. Sometimes, rather than being fined, the offending couple would be expected to publicly cleanse their home with salt and smoke, and in extreme cases, sacrifice a chicken to make amends. You imagine lying awake in a smoke-choked hut, trying to explain to your children why the rooster's gone and the floor smells like grilled guilt. Tonight's sex story comes from a lesser-known tale in The Erotic Spirit Through History, detailing a village wife who refused to let a taboo date get in the way of her marital needs. Her husband, respectful of the ban, declined her advances 3 nights in a row. Frustrated, she disguised herself as a traveling spirit, crept into his bed under a cloak, and seduced him. The next morning, she confessed. He didn't speak to her for a month. She claimed she did it to trick the calendar, believing that if he didn't know who she was, the gods wouldn't hold it against them. Interpretations vary, but some folklorists say this story inspired a regional mask dance where villagers dress as spirits and pantomime forbidden encounters. Art imitates mischief. The fringe practice tonight. Sex ban dolls. In several mountainous areas, families kept small wooden figurines either tucked above the doorway or hidden in the hearth that represented abstinent couples. On red-letter nights, the dolls were positioned facing away from each other, symbolizing restraint. On regular nights, they faced each other or, in cheekier households, were allowed to sleep in a shared basket. Children weren't always told what the dolls meant, but they knew enough to tattle if the positions changed suddenly. One woman's diary from the 1600s recalls a winter night when her youngest child caught her moving the dolls and demanded to know if she was breaking the calendar. She blamed the wind. Even seasonal festivals enforced abstinence in ways big and small. During New Year's, some regions enforced a first dawn taboo, where no sex was allowed until the first fire of the year had been lit and blessed. If a couple disobeyed, it was believed their next child would be born without direction, aimless, unlucky, or spiritually fogged. One dramatic village legend tells of such a child who couldn't grow hair until the parents performed a ritual apology at the shrine, whether true or not. The story became part of the local marriage counseling toolkit. You want bald babies. Break the New Year's rule. Michel Foucault might see in this village culture an example of decentralized discipline where power isn't held by one institution, but distributed among families, neighbors, and gossip. The rules are enforced not by force, but by belief and repetition. No priest needs to scold you when your aunt can do it louder, and your neighbors can do it in verse. In this way, the sex ban becomes part of the social DNA carried in lullabies, food taboos, and whispered stories at the well. But even in this environment of constant watchfulness, there were moments of rebellion. Some couples used red days to build secret language subtle signals, private jokes, coded touches that didn't quite count as breaking the rule. A nudge at the rice mill, a flower tucked into a sandal strap, a basket left empty as a promise. One widowed man recalled how his late wife would scratch patterns into his back while pretending to wash his kimono so the gods wouldn't see. But my heart would remember. It was abstinence laced with creativity, longing expressed in footnotes. And so, as you rest your head tonight, tucked under modern covers, far from straw mats and shrine bells, think of them the villagers who knew no written law, but obeyed the seasons as if they were commandments, who feared red days like storm clouds and loved their partners with careful timing. They didn't need calendars. They had stories, songs, salt, smoke. They made do, made rules, and sometimes they made exceptions, just like we all do. When no one's looking but the moon is full, you're standing in front of a stall at a crowded market, half distracted by the smell of grilled eel, when something glints at the edge of a merchant's display. It's small, bronze, maybe an inch long, carved with odd symbols and worn smooth from touch. You ask what it is. The vendor chuckles, leans in, and whispers like he's offering forbidden fruit. Keeps your hands to yourself, even on red nights. He drops it into a tiny pouch of lavender and tucks it into your sleeve. You've just acquired a centuries-old solution to calendar-induced blue nights, an abstinence amulet. Not to help you do it, but to help you not do it. In ancient Japan, where ritual taboos ruled the rhythms of life, amulets and talismans weren't just protection against disease or bad harvests. They were part of a complex spiritual toolkit used to control human behavior, including the hardest thing to manage desire. Abstinence amulets, often overlooked by historians obsessed with war or politics, were quiet objects of extraordinary importance. Some were worn, others hung by doors, tied to futons, or even buried under bedroom floors. Their purpose, not to ward off demons, to ward off you from yourself. These charms came in all from carved bone, etched copper, painted paper, but all shared the same intention to anchor the body against temptation during ritual no-go periods. A farmer might wear one during Obon. A court lady might place one on her vanity when the moon cycle deemed her off-limits. A newlywed might tuck one under the mattress to avoid accidentally conceiving a child during a dirty season, because even wanted sex, even married sex, was sometimes labeled impure not by feeling, but by timing. Historians still argue how widely these abstinence amulets were believed to work, or whether they were more symbolic reminders than magical deterrents. But their ubiquity in folk collections suggests deep cultural trust. It's one thing to know you shouldn't touch. It's another to hold a charm that reminds you, gently, silently, with every jingle or tug, that tonight is not the night. Some even had embedded beads that clinked just enough when moved like a tiny shame-infused wind chime. Tonight's sex story, from Sex with Kings, involves a nobleman who received an abstinence amulet from his lover as a gift during a prolonged ban period due to imperial mourning. The charm was shaped like a closed lotus, tied with gold thread, and scented with camphor. He wore it faithfully for weeks, resisting all advances until one night, in a moment of weakness, he tossed it across the room and slept with a visiting concubine. The next morning, the charm was gone. His lover returned the next day with a knowing smile and said, "Some flowers bloom better when denied sunlight." It's unclear if she cursed him or forgave him, but his poetry grew darker afterward. One of the more curious fringe tidbits is the anticipation thread. In certain rural regions, couples abstaining for ritual reasons would knot a colored thread together, usually red and white, and place it on their shared pillow. Every night they didn't touch, they added a knot. When the ban lifted, the thread was burned in a small offering and replaced with a new one for future abstinence periods. Some couples even made competitions of it, who could go longer without sneaking a kiss, who would break first and admit they were tempted. It turned abstinence into a team sport. Temple markets often sold kits during major sex ban festivals. Small bundles, including abstinence charms, incense for calming the mind, and folded scripture verses for warding off lustful dreams. One kit even included a miniature folding fan painted with clouds symbolizing cooling passions. People would keep them near their beds and fan themselves not for heat, but to waft away desire. You imagine some poor merchant in midsummer, waving the thing desperately like it's going to smother a wildfire. Michel Foucault's notion of the confessional society finds resonance here. These charms weren't just about resisting desire. They were about broadcasting that resistance. Wearing an abstinence amulet wasn't always private. Sometimes it was performative. A court lady might let hers peek from her sleeve at the right angle, signaling to a would-be suitor that she was unavailable without having to say a word. A young monk might wear one prominently on festival days to remind his peers and himself of his vows. Desire may have burned beneath the surface, but the charm said, "Not tonight. The gods are watching, and so is everyone else." Interestingly, these items weren't always solemn. Some were playfully erotic and design foxes curled together, but facing away, cranes in near embrace, even abstract shapes that mimicked male and female forms, just barely touching. They acknowledged the tension they were meant to diffuse. Abstinence wasn't framed as prudish denial. It was framed as sacred anticipation. You weren't rejecting pleasure. You were delaying it, honoring it, making space for longing to ferment like plum wine. One courtly anecdote involves a concubine who made her own abstinence charms, embroidered sachets filled with dried rose petals, sage, and tiny rice beads. She gifted them to the emperor's other lovers during a festival ban, ensuring no one would accidentally ruin the timing. She included notes with each: "Your passion is a garden guard, it with thorns." Some believed she did it out of loyalty. Others whispered she just wanted to eliminate competition while the moon was wrong. Either way, her charm designs were so admired that a temple copied the pattern and began selling replicas. Desire, deflected, became a marketable brand. Even outside the court, commoners took part in the ritual economy. Traveling salesmen offered abstinence trinkets along with charms for fertility and safe childbirth. One popular item was a smooth pebble engraved with the kanji for patience. You'd carry it in your sleeve or place it under your pillow. If your dreams grew too vivid, you'd wake, feel the stone's chill, and remember your vow. Simple, cheap, effective at least until the next dream came. And that's the thing, these tools weren't just about control. They were about acknowledging the presence of desire without shame. A charm doesn't erase your want. It dignifies it. It holds space for it. It says, I see you, but not yet. There's poetry in that. There's power. So tonight, as you lie there, untouched, but not unloved, think of the thousands before you who did the same, who placed a charm by their bed, added a knot to a thread, fanned the air not for breeze, but for discipline, who understood that abstinence, done deliberately, becomes its own kind of intimacy, not the absence of connection, but the echo of it, the pause that deepens the meaning. And maybe, just maybe, you'll reach under your pillow and find nothing there, but your breath slows anyway, because you know, now, what they knew, not everything beautiful has to be acted on. Some things are more sacred when they wait. You roll over, eyes half-lidded, senses soft, and for a moment you feel a presence, not malicious, not ghostly, just watchful, like someone standing at the edge of your room, silent but absolutely aware that you're lying too close to someone, or thinking thoughts too warm for the current phase of the moon. That feeling. It's not paranoia. In ancient Japan, sometimes it was very real, because there were people assigned yes, assigned to make sure that when the calendar said no, everyone else's pants stayed firmly on. Meet the spiritual inspectors, the men, and occasionally women, tasked with enforcing abstinence. Tonight, you sleep under surveillance. At first, it sounds absurd. Priests or shrine officials walking around making sure no one's getting busy. But in a culture where sacred timing was law, ritual violation wasn't just personal. It was contagious. If one household defiled a red day, the whole village might suffer a blight, a bad crop, or a string of misfortunes. So someone had to check. And they did. Not with torches and shouting, but with soft sandals, incense pouches, and the ability to read silence like a scroll. In rural regions especially. These figures called kekka-in, or shingi-bozu, would patrol during red-marked nights and festival observances, often pretending they were blessing thresholds or warding off fox spirits. Everyone knew the subtext. Historians still argue how much of this was real enforcement versus ritual theater. In elite circles, the role was more symbolic. A monk might be invited into the household for tea, subtly blessing the room while casting a judgmental glance at any flushed faces. In smaller communities, however, the visits could be more direct. One village ledger notes how a shrine assistant knocked on doors during the Obon festival, not to deliver news, but to smell the room. If the air was too fragrant, too humid, or too giggly. Questions were asked. People learned to tone down their evenings, or at least open the windows. The sex story for tonight is plucked from The Erotic Spirit Through History, and it's deliciously awkward. A provincial lord, newlywed and eager, ignored a local ban tied to a lunar eclipse. He snuck into his wife's chamber late at night, only to be interrupted mid-undressing by a temple boy delivering late-night salt, an offering to protect purity. The timing wasn't coincidental. The boy had been tipped off by the couple's maid. Mortified, the lord later claimed he'd only entered to warm her feet. The inspectors noted that both sets of sandals were pointed inward. No one believed him. That's the thing, inspectors didn't need to catch you. They just needed enough to raise doubt. A futon left unrolled. A comb on the wrong side of the vanity. A charm facing the wrong direction. These were clues. signs that someone had bent the rules. And once suspicion took hold, the couple might be forced into a minor purification rite. Salt circles, incense smoke, water poured over the threshold, while a priest recited verses about restraint. It was mostly symbolic, but it was also humiliating, like being told by your grandmother, in front of the whole neighborhood, that your timing was selfish. The fringe tidbit for this section: spirit bells. Tiny bronze bells hung above certain doorways or near sleeping areas, especially during red-marked nights. These weren't door alarms. They were spiritual early warning systems. The belief was that if the bell jingled at the wrong hour, say, during heavy breathing and muffled giggles, it meant a kami had noticed. Some bells were designed to chime with the vibrations of movement. Others were rigged with thread and paper. Couples who really didn't trust themselves would take the bell down entirely and hide it under a basket, then pretend they hadn't noticed the date. If the priest asked, they'd claim a strong breeze knocked it loose. But the tension didn't just come from outside. Internal guilt enforcement was equally strong. Young men and women raised in households where these inspections happened internalized the rules early. One Heian-era diary describes a court lady who refused to sleep in the same room as her cousin during a red week, not because anything had ever happened, but because the proximity troubled the air. Another woman kept 2 beds in her chamber, one for herself and one for nights of waiting. They were identical, but only one saw use depending on the calendar. If she felt tempted, she'd switch beds as a ritual. And yes, she made her maids record it. Michel Foucault's idea of the panopticon is almost literal here. You behave not just because someone is watching, but because you've been trained to imagine that someone always might be. A fluttering curtain, a whisper in the corridor, the smell of cedar outside your window. It's not the gods you fear, it's the people who speak for them. Walking barefoot, counting windows and listening to the creak of floorboards. And yet, there's a strange tenderness buried in this enforcement. In some places, if a couple was caught breaking a sex ban, but were newly married or childless, they weren't punished, but quietly advised. One village priest reportedly left dried ginger on their doorstep, a folk symbol for suppressed desire and fertility rebalance. The message was clear, don't do it again. Here's a route to help next time, a kind of erotic timeout, flavored with empathy. Even temple inspections sometimes led to odd intimacy. One record tells of a monk tasked with enforcing abstinence during a week of imperial mourning. He visited a noble house and found the lady alone, her husband away. She confessed her loneliness but insisted on her virtue. Moved, the monk left her a poem instead of incense. The flame inside flickers, but the windows hold. She replied with a verse the next day, "My walls are thin, but I have locked the wind." 2 people, neither breaking a rule, but sharing the ache of restraint. A different kind of contact. Some homes began to prepare for inspections like hosting a dinner guest. Rooms were cleaned, charms straightened, incense pre-lit. It became part of the abstinence ritual, honoring the ban, not just by avoiding sex, but by transforming the space into a sanctuary of patience. One couple even created a watch basket where they placed love letters, hair combs, and scented cloths during red nights, as if saying, "We see you, we feel this, but we'll wait." So now, as you lie beneath your own roof, think of those who slept under someone else's gaze, who measured their breaths, their touches, their whispered goodnights against the quiet pressure of ritual eyes, not out of fear, but out of belief, that some nights are meant for silence, that desire, restrained, is not a loss, but a form of reverence, and that even when someone is watching, you can still choose how to love. Carefully, slowly, with respect for the wind and the bell above your door. You step off a narrow path and into the shaded courtyard of a village shrine, the kind with moss-covered stone lanterns and a faint smell of pine and ash in the air. There's no grand ceremony today, just a line of neighbors holding bundles of rice, dried sardines, and little wooden plaques. But mixed in with the offerings are small slips of folded paper, marked not with prayers for health or harvest, but vows. Vows to abstain, vows to be faithful, vows to not touch, at least for a little while. These aren't just hopeful promises. In some regions, they're part of a system, a literal shrine tax of celibacy. You're not just resisting temptation, you're doing your spiritual civic duty. Welcome to the curious practice of abstinence donations. Ritual periods where refraining from sex wasn't just moral or personal, it was economic. You made an offering in exchange for blessings. Yes, but sometimes you made it in exchange for forgiveness. Because you broke a band day. Because you couldn't help yourself during the Midsummer Fire Festival. Or because your partner gave you that look. The one that makes you forget all the gods in the sky. So now, you pay up. 1 pouch of rice, 1 charm for protection, and 1 bow so deep your nose almost touches the tatami. That's the deal. You sinned in a celestial sense, and the temple has a sliding scale. Historians still argue whether these abstinence-linked taxes were formal obligations or just locally enforced customs, but there's no denying the records. In shrine books from the Kamakura period, entries include donations specifically linked to misaligned unions, ritual transgressions, or nighttime harmony on sacred days. That last one's a poetic way of saying we did it when we shouldn't have. The priests, often quite understanding, didn't issue punishment. They offered a rate. In some places, it was symbolic half a bundle of incense. In others, it was more serious 2 days' wages, a full carp for the ritual pond, or a live chicken. One rural shrine kept a special coop just for repentance poultry. And this wasn't limited to the countryside. Urban shrines in Kyoto and Edo had specific festivals where couples were encouraged to donate for restraint, particularly before or after important temple events. Abstaining during the week of a major deity's celebration was seen as a sign of respect. Breaking that vow, especially if you'd previously promised abstinence, meant showing up with a small fine and a very sheepish expression. Some couples even did it annually, just to hedge their spiritual bets. It became part of their marital routine. Break a rule, drop off some sake and rice cakes, laugh about it on the walk home. Tonight's sex story. From Sex with Kings, tells of a court official whose wife refused him during a major purification week. Frustrated, he seduced a dancer hired for a festival. 3 days later, his wife made an offering in his name, silk, coins, and a scroll detailing the dates and actions in full, signed with her name and his. When asked why, she reportedly replied, "If he cannot confess, I will confess him." The priests accepted the offering without comment. The official, upon hearing the news, increased his wife's allowance and never again challenged the calendar. The fringe tidbit for this section is the forgiveness fork, a carved wooden utensil used during abstinence purification meals. In some temples, couples who made ritual mistakes had to share a meal using only the forgiveness fork, alternating bites. It was symbolic you couldn't feed yourself. You had to rely on each other, just like you should have relied on each other's judgment when the red day warning was hanging from the door. Some forks had little poems etched into the handle. One surviving example reads, "To taste is to wait. To wait is to love." Wooden wisdom with a dash of passive aggression. Foucault's theories on confession and ritual power hum beneath all this. These offerings weren't private repentance. They were semi-public acknowledgments of human weakness, woven into the daily rhythm of temple life. You didn't confess with shame. You confessed with items, gestures, and bowing. The system didn't judge you for slipping. It expected you to. That's why it had a menu ready. Want a blessing after a calendar breach? Bring mochi and pray. Want to prepay for your own eventual failure? There's a lantern lighting ceremony next Thursday. Spiritual infractions became just another part of the economy. The gods didn't need your perfection. They just needed your receipts. What's fascinating is how these donations became communal knowledge. Everyone knew who brought what and why. If you showed up with extra rice or expensive incense, neighbors might nudge each other and whisper, "Looks like the Tanakas got carried away again." One temple even had a display board where donations were posted, names optional, offenses implied. People weren't shamed so much as folded into a cultural wink. You weren't the only one who forgot the red day. Just the most generous this month. And of course, not all payments were made in kind. In some wealthier districts, couples funded small repairs or improvements to shrines in exchange for ritual cleansing. A new roof tile here, a painted torii gate there. One famous example comes from a merchant family in Osaka who built a water basin after a particularly scandalous affair between two married locals came to light. The water, blessed by monks, was said to cool the fire of misaligned lust. It became a popular spot for lovers to visit during abstinence days, where they'd scoop water, splash their wrists, and remind each other not tonight, not yet. These abstinence taxes weren't always somber. Some temples embraced the comedic angle. One shrine hosted a yearly Oops festival, where couples confessed their band day blunders via puppet plays, masks, and songs. Priests handed out naughty talismans shaped like foxes with blushing cheeks. The mood was festive, irreverent, and deeply honest. After all, everyone makes mistakes. Even when the moon's bright and the warning flags are flapping, laughter became part of the healing. So now, as you lie in your own quiet space, think of the people who brought offerings not for praise, but for balance, who didn't pretend to be perfect, who lit candles for restraint, then sometimes forgot, then lit them again, who turned guilt into rice balls, repentance into poetry, and the word oops into something sacred. Not because they feared punishment, but because they knew desire isn't always convenient. And calendars, while wise, can't always outshine chemistry. You might not have a shrine nearby, but maybe you've got your own ritual, a quiet apology, a gentle hand squeeze, a shared look that says, "Let's wait, just a little longer." Or if not, well, maybe keep a bowl of rice handy, just in case. You find yourself standing in front of an open drawer, flipping through prints, not old dusty scrolls, but vibrant, almost cartoonish pages, pink cheeks, exaggerated limbs, clouds shaped suspiciously like thighs. Shunga, erotic art from Edo period Japan. You're not alone. A crowd hovers nearby, pretending to study the brushstrokes while trying not to giggle. But here's the thing, among all the breasts and blossoms and strategically angled kimono hems, you start noticing something weird. Tiny marks in the margins, moon phases, red stamps, asterisks next to intimate acts. And suddenly you realize these weren't just sexy pictures. They were annotated for timing, even in fantasy. Ancient Japan didn't forget the calendar. Shunga, while often playful and raunchy, wasn't free from the grip of ritual taboo. Some prints subtly referenced the bad days, the red marks that dictated when real people were supposed to abstain. Artists slipped in symbols, a hanging scroll with an inauspicious date, a background character covering their eyes, a barely visible talisman tucked under the futon. Historians still argue whether these were in-jokes or sincere warnings. But one thing's certain, people consuming these images would have noticed. They'd know what that tiny red maple leaf meant. They'd know what time of month that moon sliver implied. Even in fantasy, you were reminded this act. It's hot, but it's also, technically, forbidden. There's one famous woodblock of a woman on top, hair wild, kimono half undone, and in the corner, a cat stares directly at the viewer with wide, judgmental eyes. Most scholars agree that cat's not there for aesthetics. It's the conscience, the embodiment of all the priests, ancestors, and spiritual inspectors you're ignoring. There's even a poem scrawled below it. When the bell does not ring, does the fox still listen? It's a riddle, but also a warning. Just because no one caught you doesn't mean no one knows. Tonight's sex story comes from a lesser-known printmaker who was once commissioned by a noble family to create a custom shunga series for a bridal trousseau. The family included strict instructions. The illustrations must not depict any acts occurring on red-letter nights. So the artist added faint borders around each panel, decorated with calendrical symbols. The most explicit scenes were framed with cherry blossoms early spring, while scenes with lovers sleeping apart were edged in plum late winter. The implication timing mattered even when you were educating someone on how to enjoy their wedding night. Fantasy still bowed to ritual. Fringe tidbit of the night, auspicious position guides. These were small companion booklets sold alongside shunga, listing recommended sexual positions based on the lunar calendar. One might say, for the third night of the waxing moon, favor side-to-side alignment. Avoid rear-facing postures. Another warned, do not lie face up on suitachi, lest the stars reverse your fortune. Half of it sounds ridiculous. The other half was treated like gospel by anxious newlyweds trying to navigate both their hormones and their horoscopes. You imagine some poor groom squinting at diagrams by candlelight, muttering, "No, we can't do that one look. It's clearly marked for after the rice festival." Michel Foucault, if given a stack of shunga, would probably say these erotic images functioned as a map of permissible deviance, a structured release of fantasy within the very constraints it pretended to ignore. You weren't escaping the rules. You were reinterpreting them, using fantasy not to rebel, but to process. These prints weren't just smut. They were coded affirmations that desire existed, even in a world full of no's, that people could want, imagine, and even sketch the forbidden so long as they acknowledged it was forbidden. And some artists leaned into that tension. Take Utagawa Kunisada, for example, who once depicted a couple about to embrace, only to be interrupted by a monk shouting from the sliding door, "This is not the time." The couple freezes mid-kiss. The scroll on the wall behind them shows the date, and viewers are left chuckling. It's a visual joke, but also a cultural truth. The timing always mattered. Interestingly, some shunga prints were intentionally designed to be destroyed after use, printed on thin paper with soy-based inks. They could be burned after a red-letter tryst, the ashes buried in temple gardens or floated down streams. This ritual, called kage no yuwaku, the temptation of the shadow, was a way to cleanse the fantasy. A nod to the gods. A wink to the kami. We imagined it. It's said. But we knew better. And yet, even in this tightly timed erotic culture, there were secret rebellions. One woman wrote a diary detailing how she used shunga as a countdown device. Each night of abstinence, she'd open to a new page, study the pose, sketch her own variation, and note the date. By the end of the abstinence week, she had a full illustrated guide ready. Her husband, upon seeing it, reportedly wept with gratitude. "We waited," he said, "but you made waiting delicious. That diary, smudged and incomplete, is now part of a private museum collection. Her sketches are clumsy, her notes poetic. One reads, 'The stars said no, so I drew yes.'" Some households even incorporated shunga into religious festivals. During certain fertility rites, specific prints were passed among women, who would write wishes on the margins, not for passion, but for timing. "Let the next child come on a clean day." One wrote, "Let my body match the moon," wrote another. They folded these images into boxes of seeds, hoping desire and agriculture would align. The intersection of pleasure and prayer, but of course, not everyone took the warning seriously. One woodblock artist was reportedly punished for selling a shunga series that depicted red-letter nights with no remorse. His defense: "The moon in my world is always full." The magistrates were unimpressed. He was fined, his blocks confiscated, and his studio shuttered. But copies of his prints survived, circulating underground with titles scratched out and new borders added. People still bought them, because even forbidden desire has demand. So tonight, as you stare at the ceiling and your mind drifts toward images you didn't draw, but somehow feel anyway, think of the artists who shaped fantasy with rules, who knew that even in imagination, context mattered, that a kiss could be hotter if it was one night too early, that the asterisk in the corner was more than just decoration, it was a heartbeat, a reminder that desire, like ink, bleeds beautifully when constrained. You're walking through the corridors of a noble estate. One step behind a servant carrying a lacquered box wrapped in embroidered silk. It looks ceremonial, important. You assume it holds documents or gifts for an imperial visit until the box opens. Inside a robe, not any robe, a maternity robe, and next to it, a set of tiny sandals no larger than your palm. Everyone around you goes quiet. You glance at the calendar scroll still hanging in the room. The dates don't line up. The conception didn't happen during an approved window, which means someone broke the rules. And in this house, that isn't just scandal, it's cosmic error. Because when sex bans are law, pregnancies are evidence, irrefutable, timed, and sometimes tragically mistimed. Even in ancient Japan, where reproductive calendars were more flexible than today's clinical precision, the elite classes kept a close, obsessive eye on conception timing. Red days weren't just for abstinence, they were markers for what would later be considered inauspicious pregnancies. The idea was that conception on a bad day would imprint misfortune on the unborn child. Physical deformities, spiritual weakness, social misalignment. And if a pregnancy began on one of those forbidden nights, it wasn't just a private dilemma, it could be a political disaster. Historians still debate the practical enforcement of these beliefs, but court diaries and legal scrolls point to several consequences for calendar offspring. In some cases, the child was quietly reclassified as adopted. In others, the mother was sent away for extended purification. Rarely was the child harmed, but their future, their marital prospects, their court eligibility might be permanently reduced. One particularly rigid emperor reportedly demanded his astrologers recalculate every pregnancy in the palace monthly, cross-checking against lunar records. It was less about morality, more about reputation. If your child was born out of phase, people whispered, and if they whispered long enough, the child might be denied inheritance altogether. Tonight's sex story, drawn from a tangled court anecdote recorded in Sex with Kings, tells of a noblewoman whose clandestine affair with a visiting poet resulted in a pregnancy, one that became visible at precisely the wrong time. The palace astrologer traced the conception date and declared it a closed lotus day, marked for silence, fasting, and sexual abstinence. She was forced to confess, not just to the emperor, but to the court. Her child, though born healthy, was declared spiritually unbalanced and placed under the care of temple nuns. The poet vanished into poetic obscurity. She never named him publicly, only once, years later. Did she send a poem to the shrine where her son was raised? If the moon forgets its place, can a flower still bloom in shadow? The answer remains unclear, the fringe tidbit of the Night Temple birth scrolls. In some shrines, priests kept secret ledgers of conception dates, cross-referenced against known red-letter days. Wealthy families paid discreetly to have dates adjusted after the fact, changing recorded birthdays, fudging the phase of the moon, or rewriting the moment of conception as a dream instead of a deed. These scrolls, hidden in back rooms, were guarded more closely than tax records. A single misaligned birth entry could derail a betrothal contract. One monk claimed he burned 100 such scrolls during a fire purification rite. Better ash than accusation, he said. But Red Day conceptions weren't just courtly drama. Among commoners, they became ghost stories. One folktale from the Kiso Valley tells of a couple who ignored the Red Day warning, conceived anyway, and gave birth to a daughter with translucent skin. Villagers called her the Moon Child, believing she could hear the thoughts of foxes. She never married, but children came to her for advice, whether true or not. The story became a cautionary tale. Desire on a bad night might make something beautiful, but strange. Michel Foucault would likely observe that the body here becomes a living archive, marked not by its own choices, but by the time in which those choices occurred. Pregnancy isn't just a biological result, it's a timestamp, a confession the womb makes, even when the mouth stays silent. In a culture where so much is governed by what can't be said or done. The swelling of a belly says it all. No denying, no delaying. You broke the rule, now it kicks. This also made women's bodies into contested ground for spiritual arithmetic. Midwives were often trained in lunar counting, able to predict not just birth dates, but the days of conception, sometimes more accurately than the family wanted. One record tells of a midwife who, upon delivering a noble's baby early, whispered to the attending priest. She lied by a phase. The mother was later sent away for rest. Though no formal punishment was issued, her daughter was raised in the court, but never married. Her status officially unclear. Some mothers, unable to hide the timing, tried to reframe it. One poem, scribbled in the margins of a scroll found in a Kyoto archive, reads, "Though the stars were unready, the rain gave its blessing." It was part apology, part justification, a poetic shrug in the face of divine timing. Others leaned into the mythos, claiming their Red Day children were storm-born, carrying extra sensitivity or spirit vision. One samurai proudly declared his son had the tiger's eyes because he was conceived during a lunar eclipse. The boy later became a priest. You decide whether that's coincidence or narrative symmetry. And then there were the accidents. Calendars were misread. Moon phases misunderstood. Some couples claimed ignorance. We didn't know it was a red day. Others admitted to rolling the dice, believing love or lust would outweigh timing. In such cases, if the child grew healthy and strong, the parents were quietly forgiven. If not, the whispers began. You feel the pressure now, how even joy could curdle under scrutiny. A baby, once hope, becomes a puzzle piece that doesn't quite fit the calendar's frame. Which brings us to the quiet resistance. Some lovers, knowing the risks, deliberately conceived on forbidden days out of defiance, desperation, or deep belief that love was stronger than the stars. Their children weren't mistakes. They were declarations. One mother called her son the thunder's answer. Another painted cherry blossoms on her stomach in her final trimester. A reminder that even blossoms arrive early sometimes. So tonight, as you lie still and let your breath mirror the rhythm of a child not yet imagined, think of the women who carried secrets in their bellies, who counted days backwards, not from birth, but from blush, who waited 9 months knowing their moment of love would soon have a face, not perfect, not blessed by the scroll, but real. And maybe that was enough. You're seated at a wide, low table littered with half-unrolled scrolls, inkstones, and old cups of tea that no one's dared clean up. Around you are 3 other scholars, each with furrowed brows and contradictory opinions. One taps their brush impatiently against a temple logbook. Another insists the calendar was all about agricultural regulation. The third points at a coded poem and mutters, "It's not abstinence, it's astronomy." And you've read enough by now to know the truth is foggy. Welcome to the modern historian's dilemma, trying to figure out whether ancient Japan's sex ban system was religious, political, social control, or a fever dream made of paper, superstition, and abstinence-induced poetry. Because the deeper you dive into these centuries of carefully timed intimacy restrictions, the blurrier everything gets. Yes, there are Shinto taboos about purity. Yes, there are Buddhist scripts encouraging celibacy. Yes, there are court diaries mapping out don't-touch days like trapdoors. But do they all point to one cohesive system? Historians still argue. Some say these red-letter days were spiritual landmines, reminders of the body's ability to pollute the sacred. Others say they were bureaucratic tools, ways for rulers to assert power by regulating when babies could be born. Marriages could be sealed, and alliances could be made. And then there are the social theorists, waving their hands like incantations, whispering, No, it was all cultural performance. Abstinence as theater. Foucault would be smirking somewhere in the corner, his pen tapping the margins, delighted, because this is exactly what he predicted. When power seeps into the body, every impulse becomes suspect, every gesture a potential confession. And Japan's sex ban system, depending on who you ask, was either a marvel of mystical logic or a grand exercise in moral surveillance disguised as seasonal wisdom. Let's examine the religious camp first. Shinto's concept of kagare. Ritual impurity is well documented. Blood, death, illness, and yes, sex were all seen as polluting forces that required ritual cleansing. The priests who maintained this system weren't simply moralists. They were custodians of balance. Sex on the wrong day. That wasn't sin. It was disharmony. You threw the sacred grid out of whack. This is why sex wasn't forbidden always. just on certain days, days when the veil between worlds thinned, when spirits visited, when the moonlight turned too sharp for the body's heat. The bans weren't punishments. They were protections. But that doesn't explain the intense calendar rigidity in the court and among aristocrats. That's where the political angle comes in. In a society where power was inherited, where alliances were solidified through marriage, controlling the timing of conception was strategic. A child born on the wrong day might be spiritually suspect or politically inconvenient. If a consort gave birth too soon, the court might start whispering about pre-wedding rendezvous. If a pregnancy aligned with a public mourning period, it could be considered scandalous. The calendar wasn't just metaphysical, it was administrative. Another way to track lineage, loyalty, and legitimacy. And yet, even these theories fall short of capturing the full human nuance. Because among the poems, diaries, and whispered confessions, you find something else, a strange kind of play. People obeyed the bans. Yes, but they also bent them, danced around them, teased them. Lovers turned red days into poetry contests. Monks wrote erotic dreams into their meditation logs. Village couples blamed fox spirits when their timing got sloppy. You begin to wonder, was the whole system, in part, a kind of cultural flirtation, a sanctioned game of edging on a national scale? Tonight's sex story comes from a 19th century ethnographer who interviewed elderly villagers about their ancestors' Red Day habits. One tale stood out: a couple who religiously obeyed every abstinence rule for 20 years, timing their intimacy like clockwork. Their neighbors admired them. Then, one year, they were caught laughing during a purification rite. Why, because the husband had finally admitted he couldn't tell the real red days from the ones his wife made up. She'd invented half of them just to get some sleep. They were a model couple, they said, because she controlled the ink. The fringe tidbit here is academic infighting. Some researchers insist the bans were primarily agricultural, used to enforce rest periods during heavy labor seasons. Others counter that abstaining from sex doesn't exactly help rice grow. One historian even suggested the bans were psychological tools to prevent marital fatigue. If you make something unavailable, he wrote, it becomes desirable. A calendar of denial ensures that couples stay interested. He was promptly shouted out of a symposium, but the theory lingers. And then there's the ghost theory. A school of folklorists believes the red days were originally death anniversaries, marked times when ancestral spirits returned. Not to watch, but to inhabit. During these windows, sex wasn't just rude, it was dangerous. Your grandmother might be sitting at the foot of the bed, or worse, inside your body. Hence, the ban. You didn't just close your door, you closed your aura. While historians scoff, the stories persist. One diary tells of a child born on a red day who refused to speak until age 5. Then calmly said, "Grandfather's here. He says to be careful next Tsuitachi." That entry ends without comment. Foucault might call this fragmentation the breakdown of a single, knowable system into overlapping regimes of belief, power, and practice. The bans weren't one thing, they were many things. A religion, a bureaucracy, a love language, a shared delusion, a structure through which people expressed fear, desire, control, tenderness, obedience, resistance, all without ever saying the word aloud. So now, as you exhale in the quiet dark and let all the theories swirl around you like incense smoke, ask yourself, what were the bans really for? To suppress, to protect, to organize the chaos of human longing, Or maybe they were just mirrors, tools for reflection, reminders that desire doesn't live outside time, it breathes within it, that even the wildest urge can find a rhythm, that even silence, done together, can mean something. And maybe that's the final gift of these forbidden calendars. Not the bans themselves, but the way they made people pay attention to each other, to timing, to dreams, to sighs held 1 second too long. Because when you can't have what you want, not yet, not tonight, you learn how to want better. Slower, deeper, in sync with the world, or at least with the moon. You wake up just before dawn, and for a second, you don't know what day it is. The world outside your window is a watercolor of blue and fog, soft and blank. No drums, no scrolls, no red marks on your door. It's quiet. And that's when you realize you've crossed the last red day. The abstinence is over. The wait is done. Somewhere in a distant corner of ancient Japan, a gong is sounding, and couples are finally rolling over to whisper, "Shall we?" without checking the calendar first. This is the moment of reunion, the exhale after the hold, the rhythm restarting. But it's not just about sex. It never was. The end of a ban period meant something larger, something ceremonial. In some temples, bells were rung to mark the shift. In others, married couples bathed together in silence, eyes closed, hands grazing. The mood wasn't wild celebration. It was reverent, considerate. The return to intimacy wasn't treated like a dam. Breaking it was a sunrise, slow and careful. A mutual return, bodies recalibrating, fingers remembering. Historians document these reunions with surprising tenderness. In one court journal, a husband writes, "Today we speak again with our hands." She laughs quieter than before. Another, more playful entry reads, "She let me untie the charm. I didn't fumble. This time." The charm he's referring to, likely the abstinence talisman tied to the bedpost. Untying it wasn't just symbolic. It was part of the ritual, a soft gesture that said, "We've waited. Now, let's begin again." Imagine the stillness of that moment. The focus. No distractions. Just intention. Tonight's sex story comes from a letter preserved in a family archive in the Noto Peninsula. A samurai's wife writes to her cousin after a long abstinence cycle. He entered the room barefoot. The floor creaked like it had waited too. We didn't speak. The silence between us had ripened. It's short, bare, but it captures the essence of the return. Not lust, not duty, something gentler, longing, fulfilled with the quiet dignity of those who have waited. Fringe tidbit of the night, post-ban pillow gifts. In some regions, particularly among merchant families, it was customary for couples to exchange small tokens after abstinence ended. A comb, a folded poem, a fruit sliced in two. One woman carved a tiny turtle from soapstone and placed it on her husband's sleeping robe. It wasn't labeled, but he understood. Slow. It said, "We have time now." Foucault's shadow still lingers. This time, less analytical, more reflective. Because what's left after all the bans and codes and rituals? A body that has learned its own pacing. A couple who's mapped their desire with precision and patience. What emerges from that discipline isn't just obedience, it's trust. To say not yet and mean it. To hear not yet and respect it. To wait, not as punishment, but as practice. Of course, not every return was perfect. Some couples stumbled, bodies awkward after the pause, minds still tangled in guilt. One diary confesses, "We forgot how to kiss without checking the moon." But they relearned. slowly, with warmth, sometimes with laughter. A poem from the Edo period teases. The fan is open. The breeze returns. Oh, how clumsy we dance. The social dimension of post-ban intimacy also mattered. In some households, servants were given nights off so the master and mistress could reacquaint. In temples, monks offered special incense for new warmth. In villages, older couples would host quiet tea ceremonies, symbolizing the gentle reunion. It wasn't just about sex. It was about honoring the cycle, the abstinence, the anticipation, the return. A spiritual season of the body. Even the environment seemed to respond. Folk tales say crickets chirped louder the night after a ban ended, that birds sang softer, that the air smelled more like pine. A child born from a post-ban union was sometimes called a white blossom, symbolizing clarity and balance. Whether or not these details are true hardly matters. What matters is how people treated the return as sacred. They didn't crash into each other. They landed, like birds back on branches. And here's something else people remembered. The weight. They wove it into their stories. Lovers would look back and say, "Remember that summer, when we just held hands and recited poetry for 6 days straight?" The ban itself became a shared memory, a piece of their history, not erased, but folded into the intimacy, as if to say, even when we couldn't touch, we loved. And you, here, now breathing under a modern sky without charms or temple bells, can still feel that echo. The idea that timing matters, that restraint isn't always repression. Sometimes it's devotion, an act of care, a way of saying, you matter so much. I'm willing to wait. So now, as you lie still, let the final red thread unwind. Let the calendar fade. Let the season end not with noise, but with a hum. You've walked through history's quietest rules. You've watched lovers pause mid-breath. You've seen how even desire needs structure, and how waiting can be its own kind of intimacy. And now, at last, the bands are lifted. The stars align. The room is yours again. No bells, no scrolls, just time and each other. And so we reach the end. The flickering candle in your mind dims, not snuffed out, but gently lowered, like a lantern at sea. You've wandered through temples and whispers, through scrolls and silk beds, through centuries where even the heartbeat had a schedule. Let your breath slow now. Let it match the quiet rhythm of a summer night after a storm has passed. No more waiting, no more rules, just the steady hum of stillness. Outside, the wind rustles leaves that don't need permission to move. The moon, full or not, casts its glow without consulting any priest, and you warm, safe, whole, are finally at rest. Not because the calendar allows it, but because you chose this stillness. You honored the silence, then gently stepped out of it. Let your limbs grow heavy. Let your thoughts soften into fog. You've traveled far tonight, but the journey was inward, into a world where desire is a language, where timing is a promise, where even the smallest pause holds meaning. Sleep now, not like someone fleeing the day, but like someone returning. Home, at last. Not rushed, not forbidden, just right. End of script. Sweet dreams.